I am Chloe, 34 years old, and a senior compliance officer on Wall Street. At my grandfather's will reading, my parents laughed out loud while the lawyer handed my younger sister a check for $5 million. Then, my father slid a single, dull $1 coin across the mahogany table toward me. He smirked and told me to go earn my own. My mother chimed in, saying some kids just do not measure up. I did not shed a tear. I picked up the coin and smiled. What they did not know was that accepting that specific piece of metal was a legal trigger, granting me sole control over a $40 million shadow trust. Before I tell you how I legally dismantled my toxic family and left them with nothing, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma is best served ice cold. The air inside the downtown law office smelled of polished wood and expensive leather. It was Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after my grandfather Winston passed away. We sat around a long conference table. My mother, Patricia, adjusted her diamond necklace. She wore a black designer dress, projecting grief for the receptionist, but radiating pure greed the moment the office door clicked shut. My father, Richard, a luxury real estate chief executive officer, sat beside her, drumming his fingers impatiently against his knee. He checked his watch, treating the final wishes of his own father like a tedious business meeting running past schedule. Evelyn, the estate lawyer, adjusted her reading glasses and broke the seal on the primary folder. She read the standard distributions, a few minor charity donations, and then reached the core assets. Evelyn handed a heavy cream envelope to my 28-year-old sister, Harper. Harper tore it open, her eyes scanning the zeros. She let out a high-pitched squeal, practically jumping in her seat. $5 million. Harper waved the bank draft in the air. She turned to her husband, Marcus. Marcus is a 35-year-old venture capitalist, a brilliant African-American man who always seemed out of place in my family's shallow ecosystem. He gave a tight, polite nod, his posture rigid. He did not share his wife's manufactured enthusiasm. Evelyn reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small velvet pouch. She opened it and tipped it forward. A single, heavy metal coin dropped onto the table. It rolled a few inches before stopping right in front of my hands. It was a silver $1 coin. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. A cruel, satisfied grin spread across his face. "Go earn your own, Chloe," he stated, his voice laced with pure disdain. "Some kids just do not measure up." My mother let out a soft, mocking laugh. She patted Harper's hand, looking at me with narrow, judging eyes. "You always thought your fancy Wall Street job made you better than us," Patricia murmured. "Winston saw right through you. He knew who the real heart of this family was." Harper folded her check, standing up from her leather chair. "Let us go celebrate," she announced, grabbing her designer handbag. "I want to look at that penthouse in Tribeca today." I kept my face entirely blank. I reached out and let my fingers close around the cold metal of the coin. I slid it into my blazer pocket. "Sit down, Harper," Evelyn instructed. Her voice held a sharp, commanding edge that caused the room to fall dead silent. The lawyer did not look amused. She opened a secondary lockbox sitting on the floor and withdrew a black wax-sealed envelope. She broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Winston left a final letter," Evelyn said, fixing her gaze on my father. "And it was legally mandated to remain sealed until Chloe physically accepted the $1 coin." The smug confidence evaporated from my father's face. He sat up straight, his jaw tightening. Evelyn began to read my grandfather's final words. "The $1 coin is a biometric key identifier. By accepting it, my granddaughter Chloe is hereby named the sole executing trustee of the Winston Shadow Trust, valued at $40 million. Evelyn paused, looking directly at my mother, who had suddenly stopped breathing. "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, "the $5 million allocated to Harper is held in escrow. It cannot be dispersed without the explicit written authorization of the sole trustee, Chloe." The room erupted. My mother let out a guttural shriek, slamming her hands flat against the mahogany table. My father stood up so fast his chair crashed backward onto the floor. Harper dropped her handbag, the blood draining from her cheeks as she realized her millions were trapped behind my signature. I sat perfectly still, feeling the cold weight of the coin in my pocket. I watched their aristocratic masks shatter into pieces of raw panic. They needed that money. Their reaction was too volatile, too desperate for a family that claimed to be independently wealthy. My risk compliance training flared to life. They were hiding something dark, and my grandfather had just handed me the flashlight. The sharp rustle of the heavy parchment paper broke the stunned silence hanging over the mahogany table. Evelyn adjusted her reading glasses and held my grandfather Winston's final letter up to the light. The document bore no sentimental farewells. There were no poetic musings about family unity or shared memories. Winston had drafted a clinical, airtight legal weapon designed to execute a flawless financial ambush from beyond the grave. Evelyn cleared her throat, her voice steady and echoing against the wood-paneled walls. The letter dictated that the silver coin is a biometric key identifier, linking Chloe directly to a blind corporate entity established in Delaware 3 years ago. By accepting the coin, Chloe is officially recognized as the sole executing trustee of the Winston Shadow Trust. The current valuation of this entity holds at $40 million in diversified liquid assets and prime commercial real estate. The oxygen evaporated from the room. I kept my posture rigid, absorbing the monumental weight of those numbers. A shadow trust is an incredibly complex financial vehicle, a fortress utilized by ultra-high net worth individuals to shield assets from public probate courts and greedy relatives. Winston had built an invisible empire, bypassing my father's luxury real estate business entirely, and handed the master key directly to the daughter they deemed a failure. But Evelyn was not finished reading. She raised her hand, silencing the immediate murmur rising from my parents. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, her gaze locking onto my sister, the $6.5 million distribution allocated to Harper is officially classified as a conditional escrow payout. These funds cannot be cleared, wired, or accessed without the explicit written authorization of the sole trustee. The check Harper currently holds is merely a placeholder. It requires Chloe's signature to become legal tender. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, the entire room erupted. My mother let out a guttural, piercing shriek. The elegant, sophisticated persona she spent decades cultivating shattered in a fraction of a second. She slammed her palms flat against the polished table, her diamond bracelets clattering loudly against the wood. It was a raw sound of pure, unadulterated panic. My father kicked his heavy leather chair backward. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the floor. He leaned over the table, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy shade of crimson. The prominent vein in his neck pulsed visibly under his stiff white collar. He pointed a shaking finger at Evelyn, disregarding decades of professional decorum. "This is an illegal charade," my father roared, his voice cracking with rage. Winston was not in his right mind. He was suffering from cognitive decline. "You manipulated a sick old man into signing a fraudulent document to steal our family legacy. I will drag this firm through federal court. I will have this will nullified before the end of the day." Evelyn did not flinch. She placed the letter down and looked at my father with the cold detachment of a seasoned litigator. The documents were drafted and notarized under the supervision of 3 independent psychiatrists. Evelyn stated evenly, "Winston passed rigorous cognitive evaluations every single month during the formation of this trust. Any attempt to contest his mental capacity will be instantly dismissed. The legal structure is impenetrable." Down at the end of the table, Harper was spiraling into a theatrical meltdown. The 28-year-old woman, who had just boasted about touring a Tribeca penthouse, dropped her designer handbag. She buried her face in her hands and began sobbing uncontrollably. It was the same manipulative tantrum she used as a child whenever I received something she wanted. She stomped her expensive heel against the carpet, demanding that I sign the paper right now. I sat back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. A calm, chilling clarity settled over my mind. For years, I had watched Winston endure my parents' endless dinner parties, sitting quietly in the corner while my father bragged about his real estate acquisitions. Winston saw the rot hiding beneath their expensive suits. He recognized their unchecked greed. He had spent his final years meticulously crafting this exact moment, turning my perceived insignificance into my greatest tactical advantage. He knew my career as a financial risk compliance officer trained me to handle high-stakes pressure without breaking. I observed my family thrashing in their self-made misery. The pieces of the puzzle began aligning in my head. A seasoned real estate chief executive officer like my father should not lose his composure over a delayed inheritance check. A man who frequently boasted about closing multi-million-dollar development deals should view $5 million as a mere bonus, not a lifeline. Yet, the sweat rolling down his temples told a different story. The sheer desperation in my mother's eyes was not born of insulted pride. It was rooted in terror. They were acting like drowning people, grasping at a piece of driftwood. Harper Inheritance was not meant to buy a new luxury condominium. They needed that cash injection immediately. The intense, unhinged reaction proved they were actively trying to plug a catastrophic financial leak. My father turned his furious gaze toward me. He rounded the corner of the table, stopping just inches from my chair. He tried to physically intimidate me, using his height and his booming voice to force my submission. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a heavy gold pen, and slammed it down onto the mahogany table right next to my hand. "Sign the release, Chloe," he commanded, dropping his tone into a dangerous, serrated whisper. "Stop playing these pathetic games. You are not a trust executor. You are a junior desk worker who got lucky with a technicality. Your sister needs this capital for a real estate closing tomorrow morning. You are going to sign the authorization form right now, or I will ensure you never sit at our dinner table again." My mother rushed to his side, flanking me. She deployed her classic psychological tactics, attempting to weaponize guilt. "Chloe, do not be so vindictive," Patricia hissed, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Your sister deserves her happiness. We gave you everything growing up, and this is how you repay us, by holding her future hostage just to stroke your own ego. Just sign the paper and let us walk away from this mess as a family." I looked at the gold pen resting on the table. I looked at Harper, still weeping loudly, waiting for me to cave to the pressure, just as I had done 1,000 times during our childhood. I shifted my gaze to Marcus, sitting quietly beside his hysterical wife. The venture capitalist had not uttered a single word since Evelyn read the letter. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched tight. He was watching my parents with the sharp, calculating eyes of a man who recognized a sinking ship. He was not comforting Harper. He was analyzing the blast radius. I picked up the gold pen. My father let out a heavy sigh of relief, his shoulders dropping slightly as he believed his intimidation had worked. He thought the obedient, easily manipulated daughter was back in line. I held the pen up to the light, inspecting the engraved brand name, before setting it gently back down on the desk, pushing it far away from the release forms. "I am afraid I cannot accommodate your timeline," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "As the designated trustee, I have a fiduciary duty to perform a comprehensive risk assessment before authorizing any disbursement of funds. I will need to review the exact details of this impending real estate closing Harper is supposedly funding." My father's face went entirely slack. The momentary relief vanished, replaced by a fresh wave of panic. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his confident facade fracturing. "It is a simple wire transfer. You do not need to review anything. You just need to provide the signature." I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. "I need to review everything," I corrected him, picking up my leather briefcase. $5 million is a significant capital movement in my line of work. Rushing a transaction of that magnitude usually indicates money laundering or debt concealment. I will conduct a full audit of Harper financial standing. If the numbers align, I will release the funds. Until then, the escrow account remains locked. I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the conference room. My mother screamed my name, her voice cracking with hysteria. My father shouted threats about lawsuits and disownment, but their voices sounded hollow and desperate. They had no leverage left. The power dynamic had permanently shifted, and they were entirely trapped in the new reality Winston had constructed for them. I stepped out of the law office and into the bustling downtown street. The crisp autumn air hit my face, clearing the residual tension from the confrontation. I hailed a passing taxi, sliding into the back seat. The quiet hum of the city traffic provided a brief moment of solace. I had successfully established the boundary, but the real work was just beginning. If my parents were hiding a massive financial crisis, I needed to uncover the exact nature of their debt before they found a way to bypass my authority. I reached into my briefcase to retrieve my phone, intending to contact my private investigative team at the compliance firm. As I tapped the screen to unlock it, a sudden notification chimed sharply in the quiet cab. It was a text message from an unregistered, blocked number. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. I opened the message. There was no greeting, no name attached, just a single, chilling sentence glowing against the dark screen of my phone. If you do not sign the release by Friday, the feds will get the offshore ledgers, and your precious venture capitalist brother-in-law will be the one taking the fall for federal fraud. My blood ran cold. The phone felt heavy in my hand.
This was no longer a simple family dispute over a delayed inheritance check.
The mention of offshore ledgers and federal fraud elevated the situation into a highly dangerous criminal conspiracy. More importantly, the anonymous sender knew exactly how to twist the knife. They were using Marcus, the only decent person in that entire family, as a human shield. The conflict had just mutated into a lethal extortion plot, and the clock was rapidly ticking toward an explosive deadline. The taxi dropped me off at a discreet side entrance in the financial district. My building had no name on the awning. It was a secure residence designed for people who needed privacy to stay alive. I rode the private elevator to the top floor. My phone vibrated endlessly in my pocket. Richard called 5 times. Patricia sent a dozen text messages, shifting between weeping apologies and venomous threats. I ignored all of them. I tossed the device onto the kitchen island and poured a glass of cold water. The anonymous text message I received in the cab echoed in my mind. The sender knew my family secrets. The sender knew my brother-in-law was standing on a trapdoor. I needed to see the wires underneath the floorboards. I walked into my home office and locked the heavy oak door. This room was my sanctuary. 4 high-definition monitors sat on a polished glass desk. As a senior risk compliance officer, I trace illicit funds for global banking institutions. Finding dirty money is my daily routine. I booted up my encrypted workstation. I did not bother looking at my father's public real estate portfolio. Public records are just theater for investors. I accessed a specialized tracking software I use for penetrating corporate obfuscation. I typed in the name of the escrow account Evelyn had mentioned during the will reading. The algorithm churned through layers of corporate registry data. The results populated across my screens. Winston did not leave $5 million in liquid cash. The money was a phantom. It was tethered to a highly restrictive escrow account, locked within a labyrinth of corporate entities registered in Delaware. Delaware is a haven for tax evasion due to its strict corporate secrecy laws. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I peeled back the corporate layers one by one. Richard was listed as the primary managing director for 6 different shell companies. He had been quietly shifting properties out of his main real estate firm and funneling them into these hidden entities. I ran a debt analysis on those specific shell companies. The numbers painted a terrifying picture. Richard was not building an empire. He was drowning. He had secretly mortgaged his most valuable commercial properties to secure high-interest loans from unregulated private lenders. In the financial sector, we call them shadow financiers. They are modern loan sharks who cater to desperate executives offering rapid liquidity in exchange for exorbitant interest rates and lethal penalties for default. Richard owed exactly $5 million in principal and escalating interest. The debt was maturing at the end of the current fiscal quarter. I pulled up the federal tax registry. An alert flagged my system. The Internal Revenue Service had already placed a preliminary lien on his primary business accounts. Richard was hemorrhaging cash. He needed Harper inheritance to pay off the shadow financiers before the federal auditors arrived and seized his entire operation. He needed my signature to wash the dirty money clean. But something still felt wrong. The puzzle pieces did not lock together. Unregulated lenders do not hand over millions of dollars to a sinking real estate developer without collateral. They demand a rock-solid guarantor. They require a pristine financial profile to back the loan, just in case the primary borrower defaults. I dug deeper into the loan origination documents hidden within the Delaware registries. I deployed a back-end extraction tool to pull the raw PDF files of the original credit agreements. I found the guarantor contract buried in a subfolder. I opened the file and stared at the signature line. The name printed in bold black ink was Marcus. Marcus is my 35-year-old brother-in-law. He is an African-American venture capitalist who built his wealth through flawless market analysis and unwavering integrity. He navigates Wall Street with a quiet brilliance. He is meticulous. A man who calculates risk for a living would never blindly co-sign a predatory loan for his reckless father-in-law. Marcus provided the luxurious lifestyle Harper flaunted on social media, but he maintained strict boundaries regarding his own investment capital. He kept his business separate from Richard. I zoomed in on the digital signature at the bottom of the contract. Forensic auditing trains your eyes to spot structural inconsistencies. I pulled up a verified copy of Marcus' actual signature from a public merger document he filed last year. I placed the two images side by side on my dual monitors. The differences were glaring. The angle of the first letter was too sharp. The pressure points on the digital ink indicated hesitation. It was a forgery. A highly practiced but ultimately flawed forgery. I needed to know who held the pen. I extracted the metadata from the forged PDF document. Every digital file carries a hidden footprint detailing exactly when and where it was created. I pulled the Internet Protocol address attached to the final save state of the contract. I ran a geolocation trace on the address. The map on my screen zoomed in on a luxury subdivision in the Hamptons. It was the exact address of Harper Summer House. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Harper and my parents had stolen his identity. Harper had used her own home network to submit the fraudulent paperwork. They had used his pristine credit score and his flawless corporate reputation to secure the toxic debt. They turned the only decent man in our family into their legal scapegoat. The true horror of my grandfather trap crystallized in my mind. Winston knew Richard was drowning in dirty money. He knew they had framed Marcus. Winston deliberately structured the will to force this exact confrontation. If I caved to my parents' demands and signed the release form at the law office today, the $5 million would clear the escrow. The money would wash through the Delaware shell companies and pay off the loan sharks. My father would walk away free, but my signature would legally validate the entire transaction. It would cement the fraudulent contract into the federal banking system. Marcus would be permanently tied to the money laundering scheme. If the Internal Revenue Service audited the trail, Marcus would take the fall. The authorities would see his signature on the guarantor documents and assume he orchestrated the shadow financing. He would lose his venture capital firm, his reputation, and his freedom. He would spend decades in a federal penitentiary for a crime his wife and her parents committed. My family was willing to destroy an innocent man just to maintain their luxury lifestyle. They expected me to be the final blind cog in their criminal machine. They assumed my lifelong habit of avoiding family drama would keep me from asking questions. They thought I would just sign the paper to make the screaming stop. They fundamentally underestimated the woman sitting in this dark office. I closed the documents and secured the evidence on an offline encrypted hard drive. The anonymous text message I received in the cab made perfect sense now. Someone else knew about the forged signature. Someone was watching this play out from the shadows. I could not sit in my penthouse and wait for my father's next move. I had to intercept Marcus before Harper could manipulate him further. I needed to show him the guillotine hanging over his neck. I checked the clock on my wall. It was 3 a.m. The city outside my window was quiet, but the financial district would wake up soon. Marcus was a creature of habit. I knew his schedule. I knew he arrived at his corporate parking garage at exactly 6 a.m. to review Asian market trends before his staff arrived. I picked up my keys and drafted a mental blueprint to ambush a venture capitalist. I was about to detonate a bomb in his marriage, and I needed him to trust me before the shrapnel hit. The concrete walls of the underground parking garage in the financial district amplified the low hum of early morning ventilation fans. The air was damp and carried the sharp scent of motor oil and cold asphalt. I leaned against a concrete pillar in the shadows near a reserved parking space. The digital clock on my phone read 5:45. A sleek black electric sedan glided down the ramp, its headlights cutting through the dim yellow sodium lighting. The vehicle pulled smoothly into the executive spot, and the engine cut off with a silent click. Marcus stepped out of the car, holding a leather briefcase. He wore a sharp-tailored charcoal suit that matched his precise, analytical demeanor. As an African-American venture capitalist operating in the highest echelons of Wall Street, Marcus had built his entire career on a foundation of flawless integrity and rigorous market logic. He was a man who survived predatory corporate environments by calculating every variable before making a single move. He did not survive by acting on emotion. That was the primary difference between him and the reckless, chaotic woman he had married. I stepped out of the shadows. Marcus paused, his hand hovering over the charging port of his vehicle. He did not jump or display sudden alarm. His dark eyes simply narrowed as he assessed my presence. "Chloe?" he said, his voice a steady, grounded baritone, echoing slightly against the concrete. "You are standing in my parking garage before the sun comes up. Given the theatrical display at the law office yesterday, I assume you are not here to discuss family dinner arrangements." I did not offer a polite greeting. I walked straight up to the hood of his car and tossed a thick manila folder onto the pristine black paint. The heavy stack of printed documents landed with a dull thud. "I am here to stop you from going to a federal penitentiary for a crime my family is committing in your name," I stated, keeping my tone perfectly level. "Open the file." Marcus looked at the folder, then back at me. The inherent skepticism of an investment analyst flickered across his face. But he set his briefcase down on the pavement and picked up the documents. He opened the cover. I watched his eyes scan the first page. It was the summary of the Delaware shell companies my father had orchestrated. Marcus flipped to the second page containing the toxic loan agreements and the predatory interest rates originating from the shadow financiers. He was reading the numbers with the speed of a man who dissected failing corporate prospectuses for a living. I saw the exact moment the betrayal crystallized in his mind. He reached the third page, the guarantor contract bearing the digital signature. His jaw clenched so tight, the muscles rippled beneath his skin. "They secured a loan of $6.5 million, using your pristine financial profile as the ultimate collateral," I explained, stepping closer to the car. "My father is drowning in debt. The Internal Revenue Service is already circling his primary business accounts. They needed a clean shield to guarantee the shadow financing. They needed a scapegoat, just in case the escrow funds from grandfather did not clear in time." Marcus stared at the signature line. His breathing remained eerily controlled, but a chilling darkness settled over his features. The betrayal of a spouse is a profound wound, but to a man whose entire professional existence relies on his spotless credit and unshakable reputation, identity theft is a lethal strike. "Harper forged this," Marcus murmured. It was not a question. It was a cold realization. The digital metadata attached to that file traces the Internet Protocol address directly to the home network of your summer house in the Hamptons. I told him, "She logged in during the holiday weekend while you were hosting a charity gala on the lawn. She used your personal credentials to submit the paperwork. If I sign the release form to disperse the inheritance, the dirty money washes through the banking system and validates this fraudulent contract. If the federal authorities audit the trail, they will see your signature underwriting a massive money laundering operation." The silence that descended upon the parking garage was suffocating. I expected him to yell. I expected him to slam his fist against the car or pull out his phone to demand answers from his wife. Instead, the fury emanating from Marcus coalesced into a terrifying stillness. It was the calculated calm of a predator, realizing it had been led into a trap by its own pack. "They think I am a fool they can easily use as a human shield," Marcus growled, his voice dropping into a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper. "They look at my success and see nothing but an automated teller machine they can extract from whenever their arrogance exceeds their intelligence." Harper smiled in my face while secretly signing my execution order. You're the only person in that family who ever earned their wealth," I said, maintaining steady eye contact. "They resent your competence just as much as they resent my independence." Winston saw the collapse coming. He designated me as the sole trustee to force this exact confrontation. "We have a very narrow window to dismantle their operation before the shadow lenders call in the debt." Marcus closed the manila folder. He did not hesitate. He did not ask for time to process the emotional devastation of his marriage ending. He placed the folder back onto the hood of the car and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his encrypted smartphone. "We do not just stop the transaction," Marcus stated, his eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding intensity. "If we simply block the funds, Richard will scramble to find another proxy. Harper will play the victim and attempt to leverage marital assets in divorce court to cover her tracks. We need to eradicate their financial foundation entirely. We need to let them walk far enough out onto the ice that they cannot turn back when it cracks. An alliance forged in the fires of mutual betrayal is an unbreakable weapon." We stood in the damp parking garage and transformed the trunk of his electric vehicle into a tactical war room. I unzipped my leather briefcase and pulled out my laptop, booting up my secure risk compliance terminal. "Give me access to her accounts," I instructed, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Every joint credit card, every shared investment portfolio, every hidden line of credit she thinks she controls." Marcus bypassed the biometric locks on his phone. "Harper has always been careless with digital security," he explained, generating a series of authentication tokens on his screen. "I manage the primary wealth routing. She possesses secondary access to an operational checking account and 3 high-limit credit cards. She assumes the well is bottomless." He read off the routing numbers and the administrative passcodes. I typed the data into my terminal, slipping past the banking firewalls using his authorized credentials. The financial landscape of my sister materialized on the screen. The outgoing expenditures were a grotesque display of unearned luxury. Retail charges at high-end boutiques, recurring payments to exclusive wellness retreats, and exorbitant restaurant bills flooded the ledger. I initiated a digital severance protocol. I severed the linkage between her spending accounts and his primary venture capital yields. I established a localized firewall around his private assets, legally protecting his independent wealth from any impending federal seizure related to her fraudulent actions. Next, I placed a silent monitoring script on her active credit cards. We would not freeze her spending power yet. We needed her to feel invincible. We needed her to continue building the paper trail of her own greed. "I have shielded your core portfolios," I confirmed, watching the progress bar complete its cycle. L&A Holdings, a blind trust I set up years ago, will act as a temporary proxy for your most vulnerable liquid assets. They cannot touch your capital, and they cannot leverage your name any further. Marcus nodded, his expression carved from stone. "I will contact my personal legal counsel this morning," he said. "I will have the divorce filings prepared and the restraining orders drafted. But I will hold the service until you give the signal. We move in synchronized strikes. We are going to let them think they are winning." I agreed, shutting my laptop and sliding it back into my briefcase. "I will ignore their demands today. The silence will push Richard to escalate. He is desperate, and desperate men make critical procedural errors. We let them build the trap, and we simply hand them the rope." Marcus picked up his briefcase, his posture radiating a newfound lethal purpose. He looked at me, a silent acknowledgement of the war we had just officially declared against the people who shared our dinner table. He turned and walked toward the private executive elevators, leaving me alone in the quiet garage. I walked toward the exit ramp, feeling the cold morning air hit my face. The strategic board was perfectly arranged. I had secured my most powerful ally, and my family was operating under the delusion of total control. But as I stepped onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk, my secure phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. The notification banner flashed a priority alert from the monitoring script I had just attached to my sister's financial accounts. Harper was not waiting for the inheritance money to clear. Drunk on arrogance and assuming her husband would quietly absorb the incoming debt, she had just initiated a catastrophic public transaction. The red text on my screen detailed a massive outgoing charge that would instantly trigger federal banking alarms. The careful, silent execution we had just planned was about to be blown wide open by her relentless stupidity, forcing me to handle a crisis before I even reached my office desk. The notification blared, cutting through the ambient noise of the morning pedestrian traffic. I stepped out of the flow of commuters and leaned against the granite facade of a nearby banking institution. My screen illuminated with a live broadcast alert from Harper's social media account. She possessed an insatiable hunger for validation, an appetite that outpaced any sense of caution or self-preservation. I tapped the alert, allowing the video feed to load. Harper filled my screen, holding her phone high to capture the sprawling interior of the flagship Chanel boutique in Midtown Manhattan. She wore oversized designer sunglasses indoors, spinning around to show off stacks of glossy shopping bags. She boasted to her thousands of followers about a sudden windfall, claiming she was treating herself to a well-deserved celebration for enduring a stressful family transition. She paraded a quilted leather handbag in front of the camera, bragging about the 5-figure price tag. Then she made an unforced, catastrophic error. In her desperate need to prove her purchasing power, she held up the payment method for her followers to admire. It was a heavy black corporate charge card. My risk compliance training zeroed in on the embossed silver lettering beneath her thumb. It bore my father name, followed by the title of a secondary corporate holding entity. I knew that specific entity. I had audited its registration during my midnight deep dive. Richard had registered that limited liability company under a specific medical operations tax code to claim specialized federal deductions. He was using a tax-exempt healthcare operating account to fund his daughter's luxury fashion binge. I did not just watch the spectacle. I initiated a secure screen recording protocol on my device, capturing the live feed in high definition. I extracted the digital metadata, locking the timestamp and geolocation coordinates into an encrypted file. In the financial sector, every merchant possesses a specific classification code. High-end fashion houses trigger immediate discrepancies when billed to a healthcare operating budget. Financial institutions deploy automated monitoring algorithms to detect exactly these types of irregularities. Harper walked up to the pristine glass checkout counter, continuing her broadcast. She handed the black card to the sales associate with a haughty flick of her wrist. The associate swiped the magnetic stripe. I watched Harper adjust her hair, waiting for the receipt. Instead, the associate frowned, swiped the card a second time, and looked up with an uncomfortable, apologetic expression. The machine beeped a sharp, undeniable tone of rejection. The bank algorithm had functioned perfectly, detecting a $10,000 retail transaction on a medical operations card. The automated fraud prevention system instantly froze the account. Harper's confident smirk vanished. She snatched the card back, her voice shrill as she demanded the associate run it again, claiming the machine was defective. The live chat flooded with mocking comments from her followers. She abruptly ended the broadcast, plunging my screen into darkness. The trap had snapped shut on its own. The frozen card was not just a minor inconvenience for Harper. It was a terrifying siren for my father. When a corporate account is locked due to suspected fraud, the bank initiates an internal review. Richard needed the shadow trust funds cleared immediately to cover his tracks before investigators started looking at his ledgers. He assumed the embarrassment of a declined card would force me into submission. He believed I would sign the release forms simply to avoid further family conflict. When I did not answer his frantic phone calls, he decided to weaponize my professional reputation. He and my mother orchestrated a calculated ambush. At exactly noon, my desk console chimed. The head of building security informed me that a disturbance was unfolding in the primary reception area. My parents had bypassed the visitor protocols and were demanding an audience with the executive board. I did not rush. I saved my spreadsheets, smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, and descended the glass elevator to the main lobby. The scene awaiting me was a masterclass in synthetic grief. The lobby of my firm was a vast expanse of imported marble and brushed steel, an environment designed to project silent authority. My mother knelt on the polished floor, weeping into a lace handkerchief. My father stood over her, his face flushed, gesturing wildly toward the security personnel. Dozens of analysts and portfolio managers stopped in their tracks, watching the theatrical display. Richard saw me step out of the elevator. He pointed a rigid finger in my direction, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "There she is," he announced, adopting the tone of a devastated patriarch. "Look at the woman who steals from her own family. She manipulated her dying grandfather into handing over our estate. She is starving her own sister and leaving her mother destitute." Patricia let out a loud, practiced sob, burying her face in her hands. She begged me to release the funds, pleading for mercy in front of my colleagues. They wanted to humiliate me. They calculated that corporate executives abhor scandal, assuming my firm would force me to resign to protect their pristine image. They thought my career was fragile. They failed to comprehend the environment they had invaded. Wall Street firms do not operate on emotion or family drama. They operate on risk assessment. Before the elevator doors had even closed behind me, the chief executive officer of my firm stepped out from the adjacent executive corridor. He was a man who managed billions in sovereign wealth, an individual who despised unplanned disruptions. Richard pivoted toward him, sensing authority. He tried to introduce himself, ready to deliver a speech about my supposed ethical failings. The CEO did not offer a handshake. He simply looked at my father with profound disdain. "Mr. Davis," the CEO said, his tone devoid of warmth, "your daughter submitted a comprehensive risk disclosure regarding your impending financial insolvency and potential tax evasion charges at 7 o'clock this morning. We are fully aware of your attempts to extort her for corporate funds." The color drained from my father's face. The booming, authoritative voice died in his throat. Patricia stopped crying, her fake tears drying instantly as she realized her performance had fallen on a barren stage. They had walked into a fortress I had already secured. The CEO turned to the head of security. "Remove these individuals from the premises," he instructed smoothly. "If they resist, contact the local precinct and press charges for trespassing." 2 guards flanked my parents, gripping them firmly by the arms. The public shaming they had designed for me rebounded with devastating precision. My colleagues watched in cold silence as the prominent real estate developer and his socialite wife were forcibly marched toward the revolving glass doors. They were treated like common vagrants. I followed them to the entrance, standing safely behind the thick security glass. The guards pushed them out onto the busy pavement. The midday sun offered no warmth. My mother looked broken, clutching her designer purse, her social standing pulverized. But Richard did not look defeated. He looked through the glass, his eyes locking onto mine. The desperation of a drowning debtor was gone. A dark, hollow void replaced the panic in his gaze. He realized that manipulation, guilt, and public shame were useless weapons against me. He had run out of diplomatic options to secure the shadow trust. He stopped fighting the security guards. He straightened his jacket, stepped closer to the glass, and mouthed a single, chilling promise. I read his lips clearly. The financial warfare was over. He was pivoting to survival. And survival meant eliminating the only obstacle standing between him and the money. The game had just escalated into a physical hunt. The adrenaline from the lobby encounter settled into a quiet, chilling focus by the time I returned to my secure penthouse. The city lights of Manhattan began to ignite against the twilight sky, casting long shadows across my hardwood floors. Marcus arrived shortly after dusk. He carried a sleek leather briefcase containing the preliminary drafts of his divorce filings and asset protection orders. We sat in my home office, the only illumination coming from the cool blue glow of my 4 curved monitors. We were mapping out the financial liquidation of his wife when a piercing, high-pitched tone ruptured the silence. My primary security console flashed a vibrant, urgent crimson. A perimeter breach alert scrolled across the terminal. Someone was actively probing the external firewall of my residential network. Marcus paused, setting his documents down. His eyes tracked the cascading lines of code on my screen. I did not panic. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the origin of the digital intrusion. My father, a man accustomed to solving his problems by throwing cash at them, had clearly hired a black market keyboard mercenary. The attack vector was uninspired. It was a crude, automated extraction script designed to brute force its way into my local drives. He expected to find the digital keys to the Shadow Trust sitting in an unprotected folder. It was insulting to my profession. A Wall Street compliance officer designed security infrastructures to withstand international corporate espionage. A cheap hired gun running basic dark web tools was akin to throwing pebbles at a titanium vault. I hovered my fingers over the keyboard, preparing to trace the mercenary and sever the connection. Then, a far more lethal strategy formed in my mind. Blocking the attack would only force Richard to seek alternative, unpredictable methods. If I fed his desperation, I could control his next move. "I am letting him in," I stated, my voice a calm whisper in the quiet room. Marcus stood up and walked over to stand behind my ergonomic chair. He watched intently as I bypassed my own security protocols to create an isolated, quarantine directory on my server. In the cybersecurity sector, this trap is known as a honeypot. It is a decoy designed to lure an attacker away from genuine assets by offering irresistible bait. I rapidly populated the fake directory with fabricated tax ledgers, dummy offshore routing numbers, and a heavily encrypted folder labeled Shadow Trust Master Authorization. The bait required a hook. I extracted a highly sophisticated remote access Trojan from a secure archive I maintained for penetration testing. I embedded the malicious payload deep within the metadata of the fake authorization file. It was designed to remain entirely dormant until the document was downloaded and clicked open on the target machine. Once activated, it would bypass local antivirus software, grant me supreme administrative privileges, and establish a silent, invisible tunnel back to my terminal. I manually dropped a secondary firewall port for a fraction of a second. The mercenary seized the engineered vulnerability instantly. A green progress bar materialized on my screen, tracking the outward flow of the fabricated data. The hacker grabbed the bait, zipped the files, and vanished from my network, leaving behind a pristine illusion of a successful cyber heist. We waited in the quiet glow of the monitors. 5 tense minutes passed. My father was undoubtedly pacing his study, waiting for his hired gun to deliver the stolen payload. The moment the file transferred to Richard's personal computer, human greed would guarantee he opened it immediately. A sharp, satisfying chime echoed from my desktop speakers. The payload executed. The cascading green code on my central monitor dissolved, replaced by a high-resolution graphical interface. The remote access Trojan had successfully hijacked Richard's private network. My father spent a fortune installing state-of-the-art surveillance cameras throughout his sprawling estate to monitor his domestic staff. He had unknowingly handed me the director chair to his own downfall. I tapped a few keys, activating the audio and video feeds from the mansion. The screen flickered before stabilizing into a crystal-clear broadcast of their formal living room. The ambient sound of crackling firewood and clinking crystal filtered through my office speakers. Richard paced the length of a Persian rug, his tie discarded, his collar unbuttoned. He held a phone to his ear, his face slick with anxious sweat. Patricia sat rigid on a velvet armchair, nursing a tall glass of gin. Harper occupied the opposite sofa, furiously biting her manicured nails. The atmosphere in their opulent home was saturated with raw, suffocating dread. The hacker got the files, Richard announced, tossing his phone onto a glass coffee table. He ran a hand over his face. But the master authorization is locked behind a secondary biometric cipher. We cannot access the escrow funds. The shadow lenders called 5 minutes ago. They gave me 48 hours to deliver the principal. Or they seize the commercial properties and hand the ledgers over to the federal tax authorities. We are out of time. Patricia took a slow, trembling sip of her drink. Her eyes stared blankly at the roaring fireplace. If we lose the commercial properties, the banks will call in the mortgages on this house, she murmured. We will be ruined. The country club, the social standing, everything is gone. Harper stopped biting her nails. She looked up, her expression shifting from spoiled entitlement to a chilling, predatory calm. The 28-year-old woman who had spent her entire life shielded from consequences stared at her parents with dead, calculating eyes. There is a succession clause in the trust formation, Harper stated, her voice devoid of any hesitation. Evelyn read it yesterday. If the sole executing trustee is incapacitated or deceased, control of the assets automatically reverts to the surviving immediate family members. If Chloe is gone, we get the keys. Marcus stiffened beside me. I heard the faint, distinct sound of his leather dress shoes shifting against the floorboards. His posture transformed into rigid, unyielding granite. He was staring at the screen, watching his wife casually introduce the concept of homicide into a conversation about financial debt. Richard stopped pacing. He looked at his youngest daughter, his breathing shallow. What are you suggesting? Harper. She lives in a high-rise with a subterranean parking garage. Harper continued, her tone conversational, as if discussing dinner reservations. The exit ramp is a steep, curved incline that feeds directly into a busy intersection. She drives that heavy electric sedan every single morning at exactly 7:30. If a mechanic, someone discreet, tampered with the brake fluid reservoir tonight, she would lose stopping power right at the bottom of the ramp. The collision would be catastrophic. The authorities would rule it a tragic mechanical failure. We mourn, we attend the funeral, and we take control of the trust by Monday. The silence that followed her proposal was the most horrifying sound I had ever heard. Neither Richard nor Patricia offered a single word of moral outrage. They did not scream. They did not reprimand her. Patricia slowly set her crystal glass down on a coaster. Richard stared at the Persian rug, his mind clearly running the logistical mathematics of his own daughter murder. Their silence was a resounding, irrefutable endorsement. The crime had officially mutated from corporate tax evasion into a premeditated assassination plot. I looked up at Marcus. His dark eyes were fixed on the monitor. The muscles in his jaw ticked with a dangerous, suppressed intensity. The polished, diplomatic venture capitalist was gone. He was looking at a pack of feral animals who had just marked his ally for death. He had spent years providing for a woman who possessed the psychological profile of a sociopath. They are going to kill you for a bank account, Marcus whispered, his voice a low, lethal rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. The financial ruin is no longer sufficient. We are going to bury them so deep they will never see sunlight again. My phone buzzed against the glass desk, breaking the dark spell of the surveillance feed. The screen illuminated with a new text message from my father. I picked up the device and read the demands. Richard was enforcing an ultimate deadline. He demanded I meet them tomorrow evening at their exclusive, members-only country club to negotiate a final settlement. The text ended with a severe threat. If I refused to attend, he promised to release a fabricated dossier to the press, framing Marcus for the Delaware Shell Company fraud, permanently destroying his firm. They wanted to draw me out into a public setting. They intended to use social pressure and the threat of ruining Marcus to force my signature, keeping the brake tampering plot as their lethal backup plan. They believed they held the high ground. They thought they controlled the narrative. I locked my phone and looked back at the surveillance footage. My family sat in their luxurious living room, sipping liquor, calmly plotting my funeral. All residual traces of familial obligation evaporated from my conscience. The moral parameters were officially erased. I will wear red tomorrow, I said, turning my gaze to Marcus. I want them to see exactly who is walking into their ambush. Marcus adjusted his cuffs, his eyes reflecting the cool blue light of the monitors. I will have the final asset seizure documents drafted by dawn. He replied, we are taking the war to their doorstep. The country club is about to lose its most prestigious members. The heavy iron gates of the Oak Ridge Country Club parted slowly as my vehicle approached. I drove up the winding gravel path, observing the manicured lawns stretching for acres. It was a vivid green testament to generational wealth and systemic exclusion. My father chose this specific battleground for a highly calculated reason. This club was his sanctuary. It was a fortress where reputations were forged and destroyed over rounds of golf and aged scotch. He summoned me here under the explicit threat of circulating fabricated financial documents to the federal regulators currently auditing Marcus. He wanted to force my hand in a public arena where my adherence to high society decorum would supposedly prevent me from causing a scene. He expected me to quietly swallow my pride and sign the trust release forms to protect the venture capital firm Marcus had spent a decade building. I stepped out of my vehicle and handed the keys to the waiting valet. I did not wear the neutral, unassuming business attire my family was accustomed to seeing me in. I wore a tailored, vibrant crimson sheath dress. It was a striking, unapologetic color that commanded the attention of every eye in the vicinity. Walking through the brass and glass doors of the main clubhouse, my heels struck the imported marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic cadence. The ambient noise of polite chatter and clinking crystal washed over me. I scanned the grand dining room. It was packed with local politicians, corporate executives, and real estate developers. This was the exact audience my father intended to use as his leverage. I found them seated at a prime table near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 18th hole. Richard, Patricia, and Harper sat together, projecting a flawless image of aristocratic superiority. My father held a snifter of amber liquid, engaged in polite conversation with a prominent state senator seated at the adjacent table. My mother wore a pristine white linen suit, her posture rigid, her chin tilted upward in practiced arrogance. Harper sat beside her, sipping a mimosa, playing the role of the innocent, pampered heir. They looked untouchable. They looked like people who dictated the rules of the world. I navigated the crowded dining floor. Conversations paused as I walked past. The crimson dress acted as a visual declaration of war among a sea of muted pastels and conservative navy suits. My father noticed my approach. His polite smile dissolved, replaced by a cold, victorious smirk. He genuinely believed my presence confirmed his ultimate triumph. He thought the blackmail had worked. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat directly across from him. I did not offer a greeting. I folded my hands on the pristine white tablecloth and waited. Patricia let out a soft, theatrical sigh, meant to convey maternal disappointment. She leaned toward the senator at the next table, offering a faux apologetic smile. Family business, Patricia murmured, ensuring her voice carried just enough to be overheard by their wealthy peers. It is always so exhausting dealing with the difficult child, but we must protect our legacy. Richard turned his attention back to me. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick, folded legal document. He smoothed the creases and slid it across the white tablecloth. The paper came to a halt right in front of my hands. It was the sole executor authorization form. A single signature from me would release the escrow funds, wash the dirty money through his Delaware shell companies, and clear his toxic debt with the shadow financiers. He placed a silver fountain pen on top of the document. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, invading my personal space. Sign it. Chloe, Richard instructed. His voice was kept low, maintaining the illusion of a quiet family discussion. But the underlying tone was serrated and lethal. You are going to sign the authorization, and you are going to transfer the funds to your sister account by noon. If your pen hesitates for even a second, I will hit send on an email that will initiate a federal inquiry into your brother-in-law. Marcus will lose his license to trade. His firm will be liquidated. You are out of options. Harper smirked, swirling the orange juice in her crystal glass. Just be a good sister for once in your life. She chimed in. Stop making everything so difficult. You are embarrassing yourself in front of dad friends. They sat back, waiting for my shoulders to slump. They waited for the familiar signs of submission, the quiet defeat they had conditioned into me since childhood. They expected me to pick up the silver pen and surrender my leverage to save an innocent man. I looked at the authorization form. I looked at the silver pen. Then, I looked directly into my father's eyes, and I smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the cold, chilling smile of a predator admiring its trapped prey. I reached into my designer clutch, bypassing the silver pen entirely. I withdrew my encrypted smartphone and placed it flat on the table. The screen illuminated, displaying a single audio file. I did not shout. I did not cause a hysterical scene. The true art of destruction requires surgical precision. I tapped the screen and slid the volume slider up just enough to pierce the immediate perimeter of our table. The audio playback began. The sound quality was immaculate, captured directly from the hidden cameras inside their own living room the night before. Harper's voice filled the quiet, refined air of the country club dining area. If a mechanic, someone discreet, tampered with the brake fluid reservoir tonight, she would lose stopping power right at the bottom of the ramp. The collision would be catastrophic. The authorities would rule it a tragic mechanical failure. We mourn. We attend the funeral. And we take control of the trust by Monday. The recording played with crystal clarity. The state senator seated at the adjacent table froze, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. A wealthy real estate investor sitting behind my mother turned his head, his brow furrowing in profound confusion and dawning horror. The polite chatter in our immediate vicinity died an instant death. The blood vanished from Patricia's face. Her meticulously maintained aristocratic mask shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her jaw dropped open, and she stared at the smartphone as if it were a live explosive device resting on her pristine tablecloth. Harper dropped her mimosa glass. It tipped over, spilling cold orange juice across the white linen. But she did not even notice. She was paralyzed, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror, realizing her own voice had just broadcast a premeditated murder plot in a room full of influential witnesses. Richard reacted with pure, unfiltered panic. He lunged across the table, his arms knocking over the silver pen and the legal documents. He slammed his heavy hand down onto the smartphone, desperately trying to muffle the speaker. His breathing turned ragged, his chest heaving under his expensive suit jacket. He looked around the dining room, his eyes darting frantically, assessing the blast radius of the audio recording. The wealthy peers he had spent decades trying to impress were staring at him with a mixture of disgust and sheer alarm. He looked back at me, his face twisting into a mask of feral desperation. He tried to speak, tried to formulate a defense or a lie, but his throat betrayed him. He was suffocating under the weight of his exposed criminality. I did not flinch when he slammed his hand onto my phone. I simply leaned forward, bridging the short distance across the table until my face was mere inches from his ear. The ambient noise of the country club remained dead, ensuring my words sliced through the air with zero interference. If you ever dare to threaten my career, Marcus Firm, or my physical safety again, I whispered, my voice an icy, lethal current. This exact audio file will be sitting on the desk of the district attorney before you can even reach your car. I have the metadata, the timestamps, and the original video feed secured on an encrypted server. You just planned a homicide. That carries a mandatory prison sentence. I slowly pulled back, observing the catastrophic wreckage of their pride. My mother was shaking, her hands clutching her pearl necklace as she realized her country club status was permanently eradicated. Harper looked physically ill, her spoiled demeanor replaced by the horrifying realization that she was facing serious felony charges. Richard slowly removed his hand from my phone. He sank back into his chair, a broken, defeated man. The leverage he thought he possessed over me had been incinerated. He was no longer staring at a compliant daughter. He realized he was looking at the architect of his impending demise. The realization stripped away the last remnants of his arrogance, leaving behind only the primal fear of a cornered debtor. I picked up my smartphone, slipped it back into my crimson clutch, and stood up from the table. I did not take the authorization document. I left it sitting in the spilled mimosa juice. The surrounding tables watched in silent awe as I turned my back on my family. But as I walked away, heading toward the grand exit of the clubhouse, my phone vibrated in my hand. It was a security alert from my legal team. The situation was not over. Driven by the primal fear of a federal tax audit and the looming threat of the shadow financiers, my father realized extortion and murder were no longer viable options. He had to pivot to a far more desperate, direct assault. He was going to bypass the inheritance requirement entirely and attack the very foundation of my personal life. The war was shifting from the shadows into the courtroom. The notification on my phone buzzed as my driver pulled away from the country club gates. It was a high-priority alert from the concierge desk at my residential building. The message indicated a legal courier had bypassed standard protocol and demanded immediate access to my floor. My father had realized blackmail and threats of physical harm were useless. He had pivoted to a desperate legal assault. I arrived at my building 30 minutes later. The doorman looked unusually tense. A man in a cheap gray suit stepped forward the moment I entered the lobby. He thrust a thick manila envelope into my hands, stated my name for confirmation, and walked briskly out the glass doors. I did not open the envelope in the lobby. I rode the private elevator up to my penthouse. The silence of the ascent provided a stark contrast to the impending legal warfare resting in my palms. Inside my home office, I broke the seal and spread the documents across my glass desk. It was an emergency court injunction and a preliminary eviction order. Patricia was listed as the primary plaintiff. My mother had filed a sworn affidavit in civil court claiming that my residence was purchased using embezzled funds from the family real estate corporation. To support this fabricated narrative, her lawyers had attached dozens of doctored bank statements. They took old, minor wire transfers from over a decade ago, funds they provided during my early college years, and altered the dates and amounts. They constructed a paper trail designed to convince a judge that my financial independence was an illusion funded entirely by my father's business. The injunction demanded the immediate freezing of the property and ordered me to vacate the premises pending a full financial audit. They expected this tactic to break my resolve. In their minds, losing the roof over my head would trigger raw panic. They pictured me sitting on the sidewalk, surrounded by my belongings, begging them for a place to sleep. They assumed I would trade my signature on the shadow trust release forms in exchange for keeping my home. I poured myself a glass of cold mineral water and looked around the expansive living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the Manhattan skyline. I purchased this property 3 years ago, using the bonuses I earned from dismantling corrupt trading floors. It was the physical manifestation of my grueling work ethic. My parents failed to account for a basic principle of my profession. A senior compliance officer never leaves her primary assets exposed. The moment I closed on this property, I recognized the inherent volatility of sharing a bloodline with Richard and Patricia. I understood that their greed would eventually target my success. I did not leave the deed in my name. I had transferred the total ownership of the penthouse into an irrevocable blind trust. The legal structure shielded the asset from any personal liability claims, civil lawsuits, or family court disputes. On paper, I was merely a tenant leasing the space from a faceless corporate entity. My parents were suing a ghost. The sheer incompetence of their legal strike was astounding. By falsifying the wire transfers and submitting them to a judge, my mother had committed perjury. But the implications went far deeper than a simple civil misstep. They had mailed these forged documents across state lines, using the Postal Service to execute an extortion plot. They had leveraged a federal institution to commit property fraud. This was textbook mail fraud. It was a federal crime carrying severe mandatory sentencing guidelines. My father thought he was executing a brilliant tactical maneuver to render me homeless. He had actually handed me a signed, notarized confession of federal fraud. A traditional response would involve hiring an expensive defense attorney to fight the eviction in civil court. We would exchange motions, argue before a judge, and drag the process out for months. I had no intention of playing their slow, predictable game. I did not need a defense attorney. I needed a federal prosecutor. I sat at my workstation and initiated a secure encrypted channel. I bypassed local jurisdictions entirely. I pulled the digital records of the true property deed and the blind trust formation documents. I extracted the original, unaltered bank statements from my secure cloud archives, highlighting the exact discrepancies where my parents had doctored the numbers. I compiled these files into a pristine, cross-referenced digital dossier. I added the audio recording of Harper detailing the brake tampering plot, providing the necessary context for their escalating desperation. I routed the entire package directly to a specialized contact within the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The transmission took less than 4 seconds. The legal counterstrike occurred in total silence. I did not send a cease and desist letter. I did not call my mother to scream about the forged documents. I let the civil court injunction sit on my desk, gathering dust. The federal authorities were now holding all the puzzle pieces. They possessed the evidence of the shadow trust, the forged loan guarantor signature involving Marcus, the money laundering shell companies, and the mail fraud. The net was woven tight. The federal gears were turning in the background, preparing a synchronized raid that would dismantle my family empire in a single morning. But a silent victory was insufficient. Winston had tasked me with exposing the rot hiding beneath their aristocratic facade. Marcus needed his freedom from a marriage built on lies. The federal agents required the suspects to remain oblivious and gathered in a single location to execute the warrants efficiently. I needed to draw them out one final time. I needed them to stand on the public stage and double down on their arrogance. The opportunity arrived the very next afternoon. My secure phone rang, displaying a known number I had not yet blocked. It was Harper. I let it ring 3 times before answering, keeping my breathing steady and my tone guarded. I needed to project the exact amount of stress they expected me to feel. "Chloe," Harper said. Her voice lacked its usual spoiled lilt. It was sharp, carrying an edge of manic desperation. "You received the eviction notice. Mom and Dad are not playing around anymore. You are going to lose everything." I remained silent, allowing her to fill the void with her unearned confidence. "We are done hiding in law offices and country clubs," Harper continued, her breathing erratic. "You think you can humiliate us and just walk away. We are settling this tonight. We are meeting at Le Bernardin at 8 o'clock. You are going to bring the release forms, and you are going to sign them in front of me. If you refuse, I will personally ensure the media gets a copy of your eviction notice. I will ruin your pristine Wall Street reputation. Everyone will know you are a fraud who stole from her own family." She was proposing a public showdown at a Michelin-starred restaurant. It was the perfect, highly visible venue for a woman obsessed with social optics. She wanted an audience to witness my supposed surrender. She wanted to reclaim the power she felt she had lost. "I will be there," I replied softly, letting my voice waver just a fraction of an inch to simulate defeat. "I will bring the papers." I ended the call and set the phone down on the glass desk. A cold, calculating smile crept across my face. Harper thought she was orchestrating my public humiliation. She had no idea she had just scheduled her own execution. I picked up my phone again and drafted a brief, encrypted message to Marcus. "The venue is set," I typed. "Bring the credit card statements and the photographs. It is time to let her drown." I walked into my dressing room to prepare for the evening. The final act was approaching. My family had spent their entire lives operating under the delusion that their wealth shielded them from consequences. Tonight, they would learn that arrogance is the heaviest anchor a person can wear when the water begins to rise. I just needed to stand back and watch them step onto the block. The ambient lighting inside the Michelin-starred restaurant offered a stark contrast to the sterile, bright glow of my corporate office. Crystal chandeliers hung low over tables, draped in heavy white linen. Waiters moved silently across the plush carpeting, carrying silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. It was a sanctuary for the elite, a place where hushed voices and refined manners were the strict currency of entry. Harper chose this exact venue for a reason. She thrived on social leverage, believing that my desire to maintain professional decorum would force me into quiet submission. I arrived wearing a tailored ivory blazer, projecting a calm, unbothered exterior. The maitre d' escorted me to a secluded corner booth. Harper was already seated, swirling a glass of dark red wine. Her designer handbag sat conspicuously on the table, a pathetic shield to mask the terror simmering beneath her flawless makeup. She did not offer a greeting. Her eyes immediately darted to the leather folder I carried, assuming it contained the release forms she desperately needed to access the $6.5 million escrow account. "Sit down and hand me the pen," Harper instructed, her voice tight with forced authority. "We are ending this ridiculous power trip tonight. Mom and Dad already filed the eviction papers for your apartment. You have 0 leverage left. Chloe." I slid into the leather booth opposite her. I placed the folder on the table, but kept my hands resting firmly over the leather cover. I did not order a drink. I simply observed my younger sister, The stress of the frozen bank accounts and the looming shadow financiers had carved faint lines around her mouth. Her usual polished arrogance was fracturing, revealing a frantic, cornered animal. "You misunderstood the legal notice you sent to my building," I replied, my tone flat and clinical. "You tried to evict a blind trust. The federal authorities are currently reviewing those forged property claims. Your attempt to render me homeless just generated a mail fraud investigation." Harper gripped the stem of her wine glass, her knuckles turning white. She refused to process the reality of her legal peril. Her mind, conditioned by decades of parental shielding, simply rejected any scenario where she faced actual consequences. She decided to pivot to her favorite tactic: public humiliation. "You greedy, pathetic thief." Harper raised her voice, ensuring the volume breached the quiet perimeter of our booth. The wealthy patrons seated at the adjacent tables paused their conversations. Silverware clinked softly as heads turned in our direction. Harper fed on the attention. She wanted an audience to witness my supposed cruelty. "You are holding my inheritance hostage out of pure, bitter jealousy. You cannot stand that I found a successful husband while you sit alone in a cubicle, counting other people's money." I kept my posture relaxed, maintaining unbroken eye contact. I did not shrink from the stares of the surrounding diners. Her attempt to shame me was irrelevant. She was holding a lit match in a room full of gasoline, unaware that the doors were locked. "Marcus manages legitimate venture capital." I corrected her smoothly. "You are currently attempting to launder dirty money through a Delaware shell company to save our father from federal prison. You are not a wealthy heiress. Harper, you are an accessory to financial crimes." The blunt delivery of the truth severed her remaining restraint. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. With a sudden, erratic motion, Harper hurled the contents of her crystal glass directly across the table. The dark red wine splashed across the front of my crisp ivory blazer, staining the expensive fabric with a stark, jagged pattern. Drops of Pinot Noir splattered against my collarbone and pooled on the white tablecloth. Several diners gasped. A waiter took a hesitant step forward. Unsure how to handle the sudden breach of high society etiquette, I did not flinch. I did not raise a hand to wipe the wine from my face. I just stared at her, letting the silence amplify her erratic behavior. "I earned that money," Harper shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Her chest heaved as she leaned over the table, pointing a shaking finger at my face. I endured that senile old man. I sat in that miserable study, listening to his pointless stories. I smiled and wiped his chin while you were playing corporate hotshot. I deserve every single cent of that $5 million for putting up with him. You are going to sign that paper right now. She confessed her deep, resounding disgust for our grandfather at the top of her lungs. The performance stripped away her victim facade, exposing the hollow, greedy core beneath her designer clothes. The patrons staring at us no longer saw a distressed sister. They saw a volatile, entitled predator. Before Harper could demand the pen again, a tall, imposing figure stepped out from the shadows near the restaurant entrance. Marcus strode across the dining room floor. He wore a sharp, custom-fitted charcoal suit, his presence commanding immediate respect. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on his wife. The warmth and patience he usually carried had been replaced by a chilling, predatory stillness. Harper spotted him approaching. A wave of immense relief washed over her flushed face. Her delusion convinced her that her husband had arrived to act as her ultimate shield. She thought Marcus was here to rescue her from my defiance. "Marcus, thank God," Harper cried out, immediately shifting her tone to a desperate, fragile whimper. She stood up, reaching her hands out toward him. "Chloe is attacking me. She is trying to steal the estate money and ruin our family. You have to tell her to stop." Marcus stopped 2 feet from the table. He did not reach out to hold her hands. He looked at the red wine dripping from my blazer, then shifted his icy gaze back to the woman he had married. He reached inside his breast pocket and withdrew a thick manila envelope. He dropped it onto the wine-stained tablecloth with a heavy, definitive thud. "I am not here to discuss your grandfather money," Marcus stated. His deep baritone voice sliced through the tension, carrying a lethal, Quiet authority. I am here to discuss the investment strategy you applied to our son education fund. Harper's hands dropped to her sides. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, ashen gray. What are you talking about? She stammered. Taking a small step backward, Marcus pulled the tab on the envelope. He slid a stack of glossy, high-definition photographs across the table. The images were undeniably clear. They displayed Harper walking into a boutique luxury hotel, holding hands with a muscular, heavily tattooed man. The next photograph showed them kissing in the hotel lobby. The final image captured them entering a private suite. The timestamps printed in the bottom corner of the photos matched the exact dates Harper claimed she was attending exclusive wellness retreats in the Hamptons. You told me you needed time away to manage your mental health, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, steady calm. You spent the last 8 months sleeping with a freelance personal trainer while I was closing corporate mergers to provide you with a pristine life. The surrounding diners fell dead silent. The high society crowd was witnessing the brutal, real-time dismantling of a marriage. Harper's mouth opened and closed, but her vocal cords paralyzed. Her eyes darted from the photographs to her husband's rigid face. She tried to formulate a lie, but the evidence was irrefutable. The infidelity is a predictable disappointment, Marcus continued. Drawing a second stack of paper from the envelope, he tossed a bundle of financial ledgers next to the photographs. But the theft is an unforgivable offense. I watched Marcus execute the final blow. He did not yell. The restraint he showed was a terrifying testament to his analytical mind. I established a 529 education trust for our son the week he was born, Marcus explained, his eyes piercing through her panic. It was a secure portfolio meant to guarantee his future. This morning, Chloe helped me bypass the security protocols you manipulated. You drained his college fund. Harper, you siphoned $300,000 out of your own child savings to pay for your hotel suites, your designer handbags, and the luxury watch sitting on your lover's wrist. You stole from a 4-year-old boy. Harper's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the plush restaurant carpet, her knees hitting the floor with a soft thud. Her designer handbag tipped over, spilling lipstick and credit cards across the ground. She grabbed the fabric of Marcus' tailored trousers, her fingers digging desperately into his pant leg. Please, Marcus, she sobbed, her voice breaking into a ragged, pathetic wail. I can explain. It was a mistake. I was stressed. I needed an outlet. I will put the money back. Dad is getting the $5 million. I will ask him to refill the account. Just do not leave me. Please do not take my son away. Marcus looked down at the weeping, shattered woman clinging to his shoes. He felt no pity. He saw a liability that had actively threatened his child's future. He smoothly stepped backward, tearing his pant leg from her desperate grip. She fell forward, her hands slapping against the carpet. The locks on the penthouse have already been changed. Marcus delivered his final, merciless verdict. The joint accounts are permanently frozen. The divorce papers and the restraining order will be delivered to your parents' estate before dawn. Do not ever attempt to contact my son again. Marcus turned his back on her, offering me a single, respectful nod before striding toward the exit. He walked out of the restaurant, leaving the wreckage of his marriage behind him without a single glance over his shoulder. I stood up, adjusting my stained blazer. Harper remained on the floor in the middle of the luxury dining room, sobbing hysterically amidst the dropped photographs of her infidelity and the banking ledgers proving her theft. The elite diners stared at her with unvarnished disgust. The waiters stepped around her as if she were a piece of discarded trash. She was entirely alone, stripped of her husband, her wealth, and her dignity. Her only remaining shield was completely pulverized. I picked up the leather folder containing the trust authorization form. I looked down at my sister, watching her mind fracture under the crushing weight of public humiliation and impending bankruptcy. I suggest you call Richard. I told her softly. Tell him the venture capitalist just closed his checkbook. I walked out of the Michelin-starred restaurant into the cool night air. The psychological crisis I left behind on that dining room floor was merely the catalyst. Harper would inevitably make that frantic, hysterical phone call to our father. The The realization that Marcus was no longer a viable target for their fraudulent loans would back Richard into the ultimate corner. The financial hemorrhage was turning fatal. My father was about to issue his final, desperate ultimatum, setting the stage for a collision that would end with federal handcuffs. The drive back to my secure residence felt like gliding through a vacuum. The chaotic breakdown of my sister at the restaurant was already fading into the background of my mind. I stepped into the private elevator, watching the floor numbers climb higher into the Manhattan skyline. When the metal doors parted, my penthouse was not empty. Marcus sat at the long granite kitchen island. Beside him sat a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a nondescript gray suit and a wired earpiece. This was Special Agent Sterling, a veteran investigator from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in white-collar crime and corporate extortion. He and Marcus had forged a strong professional relationship years ago when Marcus assisted the Bureau in unraveling a complex offshore investment scam. I set my keys on the counter. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with anticipation. Sterling had already unpacked a sleek digital audio recorder, connecting it via a secure cable to a central hub on the granite surface. The physical collapse of Harper meant my father had lost his primary buffer. Richard no longer possessed a naive son-in-law to absorb his toxic debt. He was backed into the ultimate corner, facing a federal tax audit with empty pockets and a shadow financier demanding repayment. A trapped debtor always resorts to raw threats. We simply needed to capture those threats on a verified federal recording. The digital clock on the wall shifted to 11 in the evening. My secure smartphone illuminated the dark surface of the kitchen island. The screen flashed with an incoming call from my father. The device vibrated, emitting a low, rhythmic hum that echoed in the quiet penthouse. Marcus exchanged a sharp glance with Agent Sterling. The agent gave a single, firm nod, his finger hovering over the record button of his equipment. I tapped the green icon and activated the speaker function, leaning forward slightly to ensure the microphone captured every nuance of the impending conversation. "Chloe?" My father snarled. His voice did not carry the refined, aristocratic cadence he deployed at the country club. It was a ragged, breathless growl. It was the sound of a man watching his empire crumble into dust. The polished real estate developer was gone, replaced by a frantic, cornered predator. I remained silent, letting the heavy, static-filled air stretch between us. I needed him to initiate the hostility. I needed him to drive the conversation straight into criminal territory without any prompting. "Your sister is under medical sedation because of you," Richard hissed, his words slurring slightly, indicating he had likely consumed a significant amount of liquor to calm his nerves. "She arrived at our estate an hour ago, sobbing uncontrollably. Marcus locked her out of her own home. He froze her credit. You orchestrated this? You poisoned her marriage just to punish us?" "I did not poison anything," I replied, keeping my tone intentionally soft, feigning a hint of hesitation. "I simply showed Marcus the truth. Harper stole from her own child. You cannot blame me for the consequences of her theft. You listen to me, you ungrateful wretch," Richard shouted, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "I am done playing these pathetic bureaucratic games with you. You think you hold all the leverage because Winston handed you a silver coin. You think you can starve your own blood relatives out of their rightful inheritance to prove a point." The shadow lenders called again tonight. "They are preparing to seize my commercial properties. If I lose those buildings, the banks will call in the mortgages on the family estate. I will be ruined. And I refuse to let a stubborn desk worker destroy my legacy." Agent Sterling adjusted his headphones, monitoring the audio input levels. The recording was pristine. Richard was openly admitting to his illicit debt obligations on a monitored line. "I cannot authorize the release of the $6.5 million without conducting a lawful audit," I stated, feeding him the exact bureaucratic resistance guaranteed to push him over the edge. "The escrow funds must remain sealed. If I sign that document, I become complicit in your fraudulent loans." Richard let out a dark, guttural laugh. It was a chilling sound devoid of any humor. "You are already complicit, Chloe. You just do not realize it yet. Do you honestly believe I would let Marcus walk away without an insurance policy? If your precious venture capitalist brother-in-law thinks he can abandon my daughter and leave me holding the bag, he is severely mistaken. Marcus stiffened beside me, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He leaned closer to the speaker, his jaw clenched tight. "What are you talking about?" I asked, allowing my voice to pitch upward, simulating genuine alarm. "I have a secondary set of ledgers," Richard declared, the smug arrogance returning to his tone. "They are highly detailed, meticulously crafted accounting records. They show a direct, sustained flow of illicit capital moving from my Delaware shell companies straight into the primary, operating accounts of Marcus Venture Capital Firm. They show him actively advising me on how to evade the Internal Revenue Service. They prove he is the mastermind behind the entire shadow financing operation." "Those ledgers are fake," I countered, letting a tremor of panic bleed into my words. "You fabricated them. Marcus has a flawless professional record. No one will believe he participated in your scheme. It does not matter if they are fake." Richard snapped. "The court of public opinion does not wait for a forensic verdict. If I leak those ledgers to the Wall Street Journal, if I anonymously submit them to the Securities and Exchange Commission, his firm will face an immediate, crippling investigation. His high net worth clients will pull their investments by morning. His reputation will be pulverized. He will lose his license to trade. And he will spend the next 5 years defending himself in a federal courtroom. I will burn his entire life to the ground." The trap was set. My father had just crossed the legal threshold from a civil domestic dispute into outright criminal blackmail. He was threatening to use fabricated evidence to destroy a federally regulated financial institution. Agent Sterling looked at me, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. He tapped his pen against his notepad, confirming the extortion was locked on to the digital drive. "You cannot do this," I pleaded, forcing my breathing to become rapid and shallow. I channeled the terrified, obedient daughter he remembered from my childhood. "Please, Dad, do not drag Marcus into this. He is innocent. He just found out about Harper today. You will ruin him." "Then you know exactly what you have to do," Richard demanded, savoring the taste of my manufactured defeat. "You have exactly 48 hours. You will bring the sole executor authorization forms to the family estate this Friday at 8 o'clock in the evening. You will walk into my living room, sit at my desk, and sign the release for the $6.5 million if you are even 1 minute late, or if you attempt to stall me again. The forged ledgers go straight to the federal regulators and the press. The clock is ticking. Chloe." I let out a ragged, theatrical sob. I covered my mouth, producing a muffled sound of pure distress. "I promise," I whimpered, making sure my voice cracked perfectly. "I will bring the papers on Friday. Just please, hold off on the emails. I will sign the release. I will give you the money." "I knew you would finally see reason," Richard sneered, his voice dripping with condescending triumph. "It is a shame it took the threat of ruining your only ally to make you fall in line. Wear something nice on Friday. We will have champagne chilling to celebrate the preservation of our family wealth. Do not disappoint me." The call disconnected. A sharp beep signaled the end of the line. The silence rushed back into the penthouse, heavy and profound. I lowered my hand from my mouth. The terrified, trembling expression on my face evaporated instantly, replaced by a smooth, impenetrable mask of cold calculation. I looked at the digital audio recorder, resting on the granite island. "We have it," Agent Sterling said, powering down the recording hub. "The audio is crisp. The intent is undeniable." He explicitly threatened to deploy forged financial documents to extort a $6.5 million transfer across state lines. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, that constitutes a severe federal extortion felony. The threat against a registered venture capital firm elevates the charges significantly. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow, measured breath. He believed he cornered us. Marcus noted, adjusting his cuffs. "He thinks my career is your ultimate weakness. He thinks you surrendered to protect me. He has no concept of the legal machinery he just activated against himself. He wants a celebration," I said, turning my gaze toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark city. He wants me to walk into his estate on Friday night and hand over the keys to his salvation. He thinks the pressure of the family dynamic finally crushed my resolve. Agent Sterling packed his equipment into a secure aluminum case. The white-collar crime division has been building a profile on his shell companies since you submitted the initial anonymous tip last month, Sterling explained. This recording provides the definitive, probable cause we need to secure the arrest warrants. I will present this to the federal judge at dawn. We will have the asset forfeiture orders and the arrest mandate signed long before Friday evening. I want a 40-page indictment prepared. I instructed, looking directly at the federal agent. I want every single shadow loan, every forged signature, and every extortion threat documented in pristine detail. When I walk into that mansion on Friday at 8 o'clock, I am not bringing release forms. I am bringing a financial execution order. Sterling nodded, securing the latches on his case. The raid teams will be positioned around the perimeter of the estate. We move on your signal. The pieces were moving into their final, devastating positions. My father and mother were likely sitting in their opulent living room right now, comforting my disgraced sister and toasting their perceived victory. They believed they had outmaneuvered the compliance officer. They believed blood ties and ruthless blackmail had secured their fraudulent empire for another decade. They were busy chilling champagne for a celebration, blissfully unaware that the guest of honor was bringing a tactical federal strike force to the party. The trap was primed, the bait was swallowed, and the countdown to Friday night had officially begun. The long shadows of their deceit were about to be exposed by the blinding lights of federal justice. The next 48 hours dissolved into a blur of black coffee, harsh fluorescent lights, and relentless data extraction. We relocated our operations to a secure conference room inside the federal building downtown. It was a sterile space designed for dismantling corporate syndicates. Agent Sterling brought in a specialized task force from the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus sat to my right, his venture capital background making him a lethal asset in unraveling complex financial structures. He did not sleep. He shed his tailored suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and dissected his own wife's digital footprint with the cold, unyielding precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. The whiteboards lining the walls filled with sprawling diagrams. We tracked every illicit transaction. We traced the dirty money flowing from my father Delaware shell companies across international borders, landing in offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. We documented the shadow financiers, mapping out the predatory loans Richard had secured using forged signatures. The evidence was irrefutable, but the true genius of the operation did not emerge from my father's crimes. It emerged from my grandfather's silence. I sat at the head of the conference table, reviewing the original, unredacted trust documents forwarded by Evelyn. The deeper I read into the legal architecture of Winston Estate, the more a chilling realization settled over me. My grandfather was not just a victim of his son greed. Winston was a master tactician who had spent his final years building a legal guillotine. I paused, my finger tracing a specific clause buried on page 72 of the trust formation paperwork. I read the paragraph 3 times to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. A slow, chilling smile touched my lips. "Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through the low hum of the federal agents discussing wire fraud statutes. "Look at Section 4, subsection B of the escrow release parameters." Marcus slid his chair over, his dark eyes scanning the dense, legal jargon, his brow furrowed in concentration. He read the text, and I watched the realization hit him. The exhausted tension in his shoulders vanished, replaced by profound awe. He looked up at me, a silent understanding passing between us. "The $6.5 million is not a liquid cash inheritance," Marcus stated, his voice ringing across the quiet room. "It is a corporate debt transfer." Agent Sterling stepped away from his monitor and approached our table. "What are you looking at?" Sterling asked, pulling a notepad from his pocket. I turned the document so the federal agent could see the highlighted text. "My grandfather did not leave Harper a fortune," I explained, tapping the paper. "He left her a toxic debt bomb. 30 years ago. Winston founded a secondary real estate holding company to manage high-risk commercial acquisitions. Richard took over the management of that specific subsidiary 15 years ago. My father used it as a dumping ground for his illicit activities. He funneled undocumented income through it, claimed fraudulent losses, and evaded federal taxes for a decade and a half. Sterling leaned over the table, his eyes narrowing as he read the clause. Winston bound the $6.5 million inheritance directly to the ownership of that corrupt subsidiary. Sterling concluded, grasping the mechanics of the trap. Exactly, I said. The money currently sitting in escrow is inextricably linked to the corporate tax liabilities of that holding company. The clause explicitly states that whoever claims the $6.5 million automatically assumes the role of primary shareholder and accepts total legal liability for the past 15 years of corporate tax evasion. The money is poison. The room fell dead silent. The federal agents stopped typing. Winston knew his son was a thief. He knew Richard had spent years defrauding the government. Winston also knew that the moment he died, Richard would manipulate Harper to steal her inheritance to pay off the shadow lenders. Winston weaponized their own greed against them. He wrapped a federal prison sentence in a shiny, multi-million-dollar bow and waited for them to tear it open. But what about you? Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair. If you are the executor of the entire estate, why are you not liable for the subsidiary debt? I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out the silver $1 coin. I placed it onto the center of the table. The metal clinked softly against the wood. Because of this, I said. I always wondered why a man with a $40 million fortune would hand his oldest granddaughter a single coin in front of a lawyer. It was not an insult. It was a statutory exemption fee. By physically accepting this $1 coin as my designated inheritance, I triggered a severance clause. It legally detached my role as the executor from any beneficiary payout. I control the gates, but I am entirely immune to the poison inside the vault. Winston gave me the detonator, and he gave me the choice to press the button. Sterling let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. Your grandfather engineered a flawless federal sting operation from his deathbed. The agent noted, if Richard forces the transfer of those funds into his shell companies, he legally claims ownership of the toxic subsidiary. The Internal Revenue Service will instantly audit the 15-year backlog. The tax penalties and accrued interest alone will exceed $12 million. The government will seize his entire real estate portfolio to satisfy the debt. And that is exactly why I refused to sign the release forms on day one, I said, gathering the documents. If I had signed the papers at the law office, a smart defense attorney might have argued that Richard was just a victim of poor financial advice. They could claim it was a simple misunderstanding of the estate terms. I needed to eliminate any possibility of a reasonable doubt defense. I stood up, walking toward the whiteboards covering the walls. I needed them to demonstrate criminal intent. I continued, tracing a line from the forged loan documents to the audio recording of the extortion threat. I stalled the process. I forced my father into a corner. The delay made him desperate. His desperation led to the forged signature on Marcus' loan application. It led to the mail fraud eviction notice. It led to Harper proposing a fatal car crash. And finally, it led to Richard threatening to ruin a venture capital firm over a recorded phone line. Marcus stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. His presence commanded the room. They built an entire criminal enterprise just to reach a pile of cash that is designed to burn their lives to ash. He stated, you gave them enough rope to hang themselves, and they braided it into a noose. The pieces were locked. The trap was armed. The federal agents spent the next several hours compiling the evidence into a master indictment. It was a beautiful, terrifying piece of legal architecture. It detailed wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, and federal extortion. It included the audio files, the metadata from the forged signatures, and the offshore routing numbers. At 3:00 on Friday afternoon, Agent Sterling walked into the conference room holding a thick stack of paperwork bound by a heavy blue clip. The front page bore the official seal of the United States District Court. He placed the stack on the table in front of me. The federal judge signed the warrants 10 minutes ago. Sterling announced, we have authorization for immediate asset forfeiture. The raid teams are staging at a covert location 2 miles from your parents' estate. We have surveillance drones monitoring the perimeter. The local police precinct has been briefed and will provide a cordon to ensure no one enters or leaves the property once the operation begins. I looked down at the indictment. A bright red ink stamp glared from the top right corner of the page. It was the physical manifestation of my ultimate liberation. For 34 years, I had navigated a household defined by emotional neglect and toxic manipulation. I had played the role of the silent, obedient daughter while they showered my sister with unearned praise. They mistook my compliance for weakness. They mistook my professional discipline for a lack of ambition. I picked up the indictment, feeling the heavy weight of the paper in my hands. The mourning period for the family I never truly had was over. I felt no sorrow. I felt a cold, resonant peace. "What is the operational timeline?" Marcus asked, checking his watch. "You requested a meeting at 8 o'clock tonight," Sterling said, looking at me. "We will hold our positions. You will enter the residence. You will let Richard present his final demands. You will let him commit the extortion one last time in front of the hidden microphone you will be wearing. Once he demands the signature, you will give the tactical team the green light." I nodded, turning toward the door. "I need to go home and change. My father explicitly requested I wear something nice to celebrate the preservation of our family wealth. I intend to honor his request." The sun began its descent over the Manhattan skyline as I returned to my penthouse. The city transitioned from the frantic energy of the workday into the neon-illuminated pulse of the evening. I walked into my dressing room. I bypassed the neutral corporate suits I wore to blend into boardrooms. I reached for a garment bag hanging at the far end of the rack. I pulled out a tailored, midnight black blazer and matching trousers. The fabric was sharp, unyielding, and projected an aura of absolute dominance. I paired it with a pristine, white silk blouse. I applied my makeup with a steady hand, tracing sharp lines that mirrored the cold focus in my mind. I fastened a delicate silver watch around my wrist, checking the time. 7:15. The drive to my parents' estate took exactly 40 minutes. I navigated the winding, tree-lined roads of their affluent suburb. The sprawling mansions sat back from the street, hidden behind wrought iron gates and manicured hedges. This neighborhood was a sanctuary for people who believed their bank accounts placed them above the law. I pulled my car up to the familiar iron gates of my childhood home. The electronic sensor recognized my vehicle, and the gates swung open with a slow, heavy groan. The estate was brilliantly illuminated. Warm yellow light spilled from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the formal living room. I parked my car on the circular gravel driveway, positioning it deliberately facing the exit. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet darkness of the cabin. I reached under my collar, feeling the small, cold edge of the federal transmission wire taped against my collarbone. I tapped the microphone twice, testing audio. I whispered into the quiet car, loud and clear. "Chloe." Agent Sterling's voice crackled through the tiny earpiece hidden in my right ear. "We have visual on the front entrance. Teams are holding steady in the staging area. You are clear to proceed." I took one final, grounding breath. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked up the wide stone steps toward the heavy double doors. I did not knock. I turned the brass handle and pushed the door open, stepping across the threshold into the lion den. The scent of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke hung in the air. The final act was ready to begin. The grand foyer of the family estate felt like stepping directly into a lavishly decorated mausoleum. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, sealing out the crisp evening wind and trapping me inside a suffocating environment. The air tasted thick, saturated with the pungent scent of aged cedar, burning firewood, and expensive imported cigars. It was the distinct, overwhelming aroma of unearned superiority. I walked down the vaulted hallway, my heels tapping a steady, rhythmic beat against the imported marble floor. My posture remained rigid. My breathing stayed perfectly measured. The tiny microphone taped securely beneath my silk blouse captured every single footstep, transmitting the live audio feed directly to the Federal Strike Force, holding their positions in the dark perimeter outside. I turned the corner and entered the formal living room. The staging was immaculate, designed specifically to project overwhelming power and force immediate submission. My father, Richard, sat dead center on a sprawling white Italian leather sofa. He held an unlit cigar between his fingers, his custom-tailored suit jacket unbuttoned, projecting the casual confidence of a monarch receiving a defeated subject. My mother, Patricia, sat close beside him. Her posture was stiff, her eyes dark and calculating, tracking my every movement with a predatory focus. Harper slouched on the matching love seat. Despite losing her marriage to Marcus and her pristine public image just days prior, my sister wore a defiant smirk. She clung desperately to the illusion that this stolen inheritance would magically repair her shattered life and restore her status. They did not rely on family dynamics alone tonight to ensure my compliance. Standing near the grand stone fireplace were two towering figures. They wore tight dark suits, their arms crossed over broad chests. Hired muscle. Intimidation tactics purchased by the hour to guarantee I did not attempt to leave the room without providing my signature. Beside those guards hovered a nervous-looking man clutching a worn leather briefcase. His cheap suit and erratic eye contact marked him as a puppet lawyer. An unethical proxy Richard had bribed to rubber stamp the fraudulent financial transaction without asking any inconvenient questions. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He picked up a thick stack of legal documents and tossed them onto the glass coffee table. The papers landed with a dull, definitive slap. He tapped his index finger against the glass, his gaze locking onto mine with a cold, triumphant gleam. "Sign it," Richard ordered, his voice echoing off the high-vated ceiling. "You sign the release for the escrow funds right now, and then you get out of our lives. You never call this house. You never visit. You take your pathetic compliance job, and you disappear forever." Harper let out a dry, mocking laugh. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my tailored black blazer and crisp white blouse. "You wore a boring office suit to hand over $6.5 million. Harper sneered, shifting her weight on the love seat. "You always were so tragically rigid. Chloe, you could never understand how real power works. You just sit in your gray cubicles while the rest of us actually build empires and live in the real world. Try not to ruin the ink with your tears when you sign away the only leverage you ever had." I did not flinch. I did not respond to the bait. The room held its breath, waiting for me to break, waiting for the dutiful daughter to crumble under the sheer weight of their hostility. They expected me to argue. They expected me to beg them not to leak the fabricated tax ledgers that would ruin the venture capital firm Marcus had built. They needed to see my fear to validate their victory. I offered them a blank, impenetrable stare. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the glass coffee table. The two bodyguards shifted their stances, their heavy boots scuffing the Persian rug, ready to intercept any sudden movements. I ignored them entirely. I stopped right at the edge of the table, standing directly over the legal release forms. "You brought hired thugs to a private family estate," I noted, keeping my tone perfectly flat and conversational. "You really are terrified of the shadow lenders calling in those debts tomorrow morning." My father's jaw clenched. The mention of his toxic debt pierced his arrogant armor, exposing the raw desperation festering underneath. "We are not negotiating, Chloe," he warned, his voice dropping into a harsh, serrated whisper. "Pick up the pen. You have exhausted my patience. You have exhausted this entire family. Give me the authorization." I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. The bodyguards tensed, but I only withdrew a sleek, gold-plated fountain pen. I held the cold metal between my fingers. This was the precipice. Once the ink touched the paper, the financial transfer would initiate, placing the funds directly into their shell companies and triggering the ultimate federal trap. I leaned over the glass table. I hovered the gold nib over the dotted line. A standard signature is pure muscle memory. It flows naturally, maintaining consistent pressure and specific angles unique to the individual. But I did not use my standard signature. In the high-stakes financial sector, executive officers are trained in specific countermeasures for extortion scenarios. When forced to authorize highly sensitive documents under physical or psychological threat, we utilize a duress signature. It is a deliberate, highly calculated alteration of handwriting designed to secretly signal coercion. I changed the slant of my initial letter, dragging the loop in the opposite direction. I applied heavy, uneven pressure to the paper, causing the dark blue ink to pool slightly at the edges of the curves. I disconnected the fluid connection between my first and last name, creating distinct, jarring spaces between the characters. To the untrained eye, it looked like a hasty scrawl from a nervous, intimidated woman. To a certified forensic document examiner standing in a federal courtroom, it was undeniable, irrefutable proof of coercion and extortion. I finished the final stroke. I lifted the pen, placed the cap back on with a soft click, and stood up straight, slipping the gold instrument back into my blazer pocket. The moment my hand moved away from the paper, Richard lunged forward. He snatched the document off the glass table as if it were a winning lottery ticket. His eyes darted across the bottom of the page, searching eagerly for the blue ink. A profound, heavy sigh of relief escaped his lungs. The suffocating tension that had gripped his body for days instantly evaporated, replaced by a toxic, overwhelming euphoria. He looked at the signature, then looked up at me, and a sudden, manic burst of laughter erupted from his chest. It was a dark, unhinged sound that bounced off the walls of the grand living room. Patricia joined him, letting out a breath she had been holding, a victorious smirk replacing her anxious frown. "I knew you would fold," Richard mocked, pointing the rolled-up document directly at my face. "You talk a big game, Chloe, but at the end of the day, you are just a coward. You signed away the only power Winston ever gave you to protect a brother-in-law who does not even share your blood. You threw away your grandfather's final wish because you were too weak to face a real fight. You are a profound disappointment, but you are a useful one." Harper clapped her hands together, a bright, manic gleam shining in her eyes. "Hand the papers to the lawyer." "Dad," she urged, her voice shrill with excitement. "Tell him to wire the funds to the Delaware accounts immediately. We need to celebrate. Open the vintage champagne. I want to toast to the end of this miserable ordeal and the beginning of my new life." The puppet lawyer stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he took the authorized release forms from Richard. He unzipped his briefcase and slid the documents inside, sealing his own fate as an active accessory to federal extortion and money laundering. He pulled out a mobile encrypted terminal, preparing to initiate the electronic transfer that would clear the escrow holding account and push the toxic debt directly into my father's possession. I did not retreat. I did not show an ounce of the humiliation they desperately wanted to see. I stood tall in the center of their opulent living room. I reached up with a steady hand and smoothed the collar of my black blazer. The fabric felt crisp against my skin. I looked at the people who shared my last name. They were practically vibrating with joy, celebrating a multi-million-dollar heist, firmly believing they had outsmarted the compliance officer, the venture capitalist, and the federal government. They thought they had secured their luxurious future and repaired their fractured empire. They had no idea that the ink on that page was the exact signal Agent Sterling was waiting for. They had no idea that their Delaware shell companies were already mapped, that their shadow debts were fully documented, and that the trap they had spent days trying to escape had just locked them inside a concrete cage. I let my hands fall to my sides. I maintained a serene, chilling stillness. I did not speak. I did not offer a parting insult or a dramatic warning. I simply stood my ground, waiting for the most perfect sound of the evening to finally arrive. The sharp clinking of crystal glasses and the triumphant laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling came to a sudden halt. A piercing mechanical wail sliced through the tranquil silence of the affluent suburban night. It started as a distant echo, but amplified within seconds into a deafening chorus of sirens converging directly onto the estate through the sprawling floor-to-ceiling windows facing the manicured driveway. Brilliant flashes of red and blue light erupted. The strobing colors cut through the darkness, washing over the opulent living room. painting the Italian leather furniture and the pale faces of my family in the frantic hues of an emergency response. The ambient glow of the fireplace was instantly swallowed by the chaotic flashing from the fleet of vehicles swarming the front lawn. Richard dropped his crystal tumbler. It hit the carpet with a dull thud, spilling premium scotch across the expensive fibers. The arrogant grin vanished from his face, replaced by a hollow, sickening pallor. He stared at the flashing lights illuminating the glass panes. "What is that?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking as he spun toward the two hired bodyguards. "What is happening outside?" The guards exchanged nervous glances. Stepping away from their posts near the fireplace, they were paid to intimidate unarmed family members, not to engage an army of first responders. The corrupt lawyer holding the signed release forms froze. His fingers hovered over his encrypted terminal, the electronic wire transfer hanging in digital limbo. I did not turn my head to look at the windows. I kept my gaze locked squarely on my father. I reached down to the heavy leather briefcase, resting by my feet. The brass buckles snapped open with a sharp, metallic ring that drew every eye in the room back to me. I reached inside and withdrew a thick stack of pristine, watermarked paper bound by a heavy blue legal clip. It was the unredacted, comprehensive copy of Winston's actual last will and testament, complete with the detailed financial appendices Evelyn had secured in her vault. I held the documents up, allowing the strobing police lights to reflect off the federal notary stamps. "Winston did not leave you $6.5 million. Harper," I stated. My voice was a calm, steady current that carried across the room, anchoring the chaos. Harper blinked, her hands dropping away from her designer dress, her brow furrowed in profound confusion. The flashing lights outside were already eroding her fragile confidence, but my words delivered the true fatal strike. "What are you talking about?" Harper stammered, stepping out from behind the love seat. "I saw the check. The money is in the escrow account. You just signed the release." I signed a document authorizing the transfer of ownership. I corrected her, pacing slowly toward the center of the Persian rug. "But that escrow account does not contain liquid cash. It contains a highly leveraged corporate entity. Our grandfather deliberately engineered that specific trust to hold the toxic subsidiary Richard used for 15 years to evade federal taxes and hide his illicit real estate debts. The funds you thought were your inheritance are inextricably tied to over $12 million in accrued federal tax liabilities and shadow financing obligations." The air in the living room grew stagnant, suffocating under the weight of the revelation. Patricia let out a faint, strangled gasp, clutching the fabric of the sofa as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath her. "When you accept the funds from that specific escrow account, you legally inherit the subsidiary," I explained, looking directly into Harper's terrified eyes. "You become the primary shareholder. You assume total, unavoidable legal liability for 15 years of corporate tax fraud, money laundering, and unpaid debts. The money is a poison pill. Winston wrapped a federal prison sentence in a shiny bow and waited for you to tear the paper." Harper's legs gave out. The sheer velocity of her financial ruin shattered her knees. She collapsed onto the floor, her hands gripping the edges of the coffee table. She was no longer a wealthy heiress preparing to buy a Tribeca penthouse. She was the sole owner of a monumental, radioactive debt that the government was about to collect. Richard's face twisted into a mask of feral panic. He looked at the signed release forms still resting in the hands of his corrupt lawyer. He finally realized the magnitude of the trap he had forced me to build for him. "But you signed it," Richard yelled, his voice rising in a frantic, breathless pitch. "You are the executor. You authorized the transfer. You are tied to the fraud." I reached into my pocket and retrieved the silver $1 coin. I placed it flat on the glass coffee table, right next to the spilled champagne. "I am the executor, but I am legally exempt from the beneficiary liabilities," I said, looking at the coin. "Winston left me this specific asset to trigger a severance clause. I control the gates, but the poison cannot touch me. Furthermore, I never signed a legally binding authorization tonight." Richard stared at me, his chest heaving. The lawyer frantically looked down at the signature on the release form, his eyes widening as he noticed the disconnected letters and the heavy, Pooling ink. I utilized a duress signature. I revealed, watching the final sliver of hope drain from my father's eyes. It is a forensic technique used to signal coercion. By dragging me here tonight, flanking me with hired thugs, and threatening to release fabricated financial ledgers to destroy Marcus, you committed federal extortion. You forced my hand under threat of ruin. You provided the exact probable cause the authorities needed to prove this transfer was executed under criminal duress. You just cemented yourselves as the masterminds of a federal conspiracy. Patricia let out a piercing, hysterical wail. She scrambled backward on the sofa, her hands pulling at her meticulously styled hair. The reality of her impending destitution and incarceration broke her mind. She looked at the flashing lights outside, the red and blue strobes illuminating the tears streaming down her face. She was losing her mansion, her country club status, and her freedom in a single, devastating sweep. Richard lost the last thread of his sanity. The polished real estate developer evaporated, leaving a desperate, feral animal. He let out a primal roar, lunging across the space between the sofa and the coffee table. His eyes were locked on the unredacted trust documents in my hands. He intended to tear the papers to shreds, believing that destroying the physical evidence could somehow halt the federal machinery already in motion outside his front door. He never reached me. Before his outstretched hands could cross the glass table, a deafening, explosive crash ripped through the foyer. The sound of splintering wood and shattered hinges echoed like artillery fire. The heavy oak front doors of the estate did not just open. They were battered inward by a hardened steel tactical ram, the solid wood giving way under the immense, concentrated force of a federal breach. The impact sent a shockwave through the floorboards. Richard froze in midair, his momentum broken by the sheer auditory force of the entry. Dozens of heavy tactical boots slammed against the marble flooring of the hallway. Men and women clad in dark. Heavy tactical gear poured into the grand living room, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. The bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division gleamed across their ballistic vests. They fanned out instantly, establishing total operational control over the room in a matter of seconds. Federal agents. Nobody move. A booming voice commanded over the chaos. Keep your hands where we can see them. The beams of tactical flashlights swept across the room, piercing through the ambient lighting and blinding the occupants. The two hired bodyguards immediately raised their hands high into the air, dropping to their knees on the Persian rug. They offered zero resistance, instantly recognizing that they were hopelessly outgunned and outmatched by a highly coordinated federal strike force. The corrupt lawyer dropped his encrypted terminal. The device hit the floor and cracked, his hands trembling fiercely as he backed against the stone fireplace, surrendering without a single word. Richard staggered backward, tripping over the edge of the coffee table. He fell hard onto the floor, scrambling away from the advancing agents. His chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. He looked up at the armed personnel surrounding him, his eyes darting wildly, searching for an escape route that did not exist. Agent Sterling stepped through the wall of tactical uniforms. He did not wear a ballistic vest. He wore his sharp gray suit, holding a thick stack of official warrants. He walked directly toward the center of the room, stopping just inches from where Richard was cowering on the floor. "Richard Davis," Agent Sterling announced, his voice ringing with cold, unyielding authority. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, federal extortion, and organized tax evasion." Two agents grabbed my father by the shoulders, hauling him roughly to his feet. They spun him around, pressing him against the wall. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoing through the room provided the perfect punctuation to his downfall. He did not fight them. The fight had been entirely drained from his soul. He slumped against the wall, a broken, defeated man watching his empire evaporate. Across the room, Harper was hauled up from the floor. She screamed and thrashed, her designer heels kicking uselessly against the air as an agent secured her wrists behind her back. She cried out for our mother, begging for someone to make it stop. But Patricia was already in custody. Two agents marched my mother toward the foyer, her head bowed, her sobs echoing down the long, vaulted hallway. I stood quietly near the fireplace, lowering the documents to my side. I watched the agents process the room, securing the forged legal release forms and bagging the corrupt lawyer terminal as evidence. The flashing red and blue lights continued to paint the walls, but the atmosphere no longer felt suffocating. The air in the mansion felt clean, stripped of the toxic arrogance that had poisoned this family for decades. Agent Sterling walked over to me, offering a brief, respectful nod. He looked at the chaos, then at the silver $1 coin resting on the glass table. "The perimeter is secure," Sterling stated quietly. "The extraction teams are moving them to the transport vehicles. The financial freeze on their remaining domestic accounts executed 5 minutes ago. They have nothing left." I picked up the silver coin, feeling its cold, solid weight in my palm. The piece of metal that had initially seemed like the ultimate insult had proven to be the key to my salvation. I slipped it into my pocket, turning away from the shattered remnants of my family legacy. I walked toward the splintered front doors, stepping out into the cool, crisp night air, leaving the wreckage entirely behind me. "Richard and Patricia, you are both under arrest for federal extortion, money laundering, and organized tax evasion," Agent Sterling announced. His voice sliced through the ambient noise of the living room with lethal precision. The heavy steel of the handcuffs rattled, a sharp sound that ratified their new reality. Richard twisted against the grip of the tactical officers. He craned his neck, his flushed face slick with cold sweat, searching the crowded space. "Call my attorney," Richard shouted, his voice cracking under the intense strain. "Where is he? Get him over here right now. I demand my legal counsel." I watched my father scan the perimeter of the room, the area near the stone fireplace, where his hired proxy had stood moments ago, was entirely empty. The heavy wooden side door leading to the terrace hung slightly ajar, swaying in the night breeze. The puppet lawyer had recognized the insurmountable odds. He had abandoned his leather briefcase, slipped out the back exit, and vanished into the tree line the second the federal ram struck the front entrance. Loyalty purchased with dirty money always expires at the first sight of a federal badge. Richard stared at the open patio door. His chest heaved with ragged breaths as the profound isolation set in. He had no legal shield. He had no defensive strategy left to deploy. He was just a thief caught holding the ledger. Patricia could not endure the sudden loss of power. The aristocratic socialite facade she had meticulously maintained for decades crumbled into pathetic, unfiltered desperation. She dropped to her knees on the Persian rug, ignoring the heavy tactical boots moving around her. She crawled forward, her tear-stained face looking up at me. Her expensive makeup ran in dark, jagged streaks down her pale cheeks. "Chloe, please," Patricia wailed, her fingers grasping desperately at the hem of my tailored trousers. "You have to stop them. Tell the agents it is a misunderstanding. I gave you life. I raised you. You cannot send your own mother to a prison cell. I am your flesh and blood. Have some mercy." She weaponized the concept of motherhood, wielding it as a final, desperate shield. She expected the ingrained conditioning of my childhood to force my compliance. She thought the sight of her weeping on the floor would break my resolve. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent 3 decades measuring my worth against my sister's bank account. I slowly crouched down, bringing my face level with hers. The chaotic noise of the raid seemed to fade, leaving only the cold, sterile space between us. "You sat in your living room and plotted to drain the brake fluid from my car so you could inherit a trust fund," I whispered, ensuring my voice reached only her ears. "You calculated the exact trajectory of my daily commute to guarantee a fatal collision. You traded my life for a real estate bailout. My mercy died alongside your greed." Patricia recoiled as if she had touched a live electrical wire. The breath hitched sharply in her throat. Her eyes widened in pure, unfiltered horror as she realized I had heard every single word of their midnight assassination plot. The false tears stopped instantly. She knew no amount of maternal pleading could bridge the canyon she had dug with her own malice. She slumped backward onto the rug, a hollow, defeated shell awaiting transport. Across the room, Harper refused to surrender quietly. The entitlement woven into her DNA demanded a fight. 2 female federal officers approached her, issuing clear instructions to place her hands behind her back. Harper let out a feral shriek. She lunged forward, her manicured nails raking across the forearm of the nearest officer. It was a futile, foolish act of resistance. The officers did not hesitate. They moved with swift, practiced efficiency. They grabbed Harper by the shoulders, sweeping her legs out from under her in a fluid motion. They pinned her face down against the Italian leather sofa. Harper thrashed her legs, kicking her designer heels into the air, screaming about her social standing and her wealthy husband. "Hold still," the lead officer commanded, pressing a knee firmly against the cushion to secure Harper in place. The second officer pulled a thick plastic evidence bag from her tactical vest. This raid was not just an arrest. It was the execution of a federal asset forfeiture mandate. The officers began stripping Harper of her stolen wealth right there in the living room. They unclasped the heavy diamond tennis bracelet from her wrist. They pulled the vintage gold Rolex from her arm. They removed the emerald drop earrings she had purchased using money siphoned from her own son education fund. Each piece of jewelry was dropped into the plastic bag with a sharp clink. The sound was a rhythmic countdown to her impending destitution. Harper watched her status symbols vanish into evidence packaging. She sobbed into the leather upholstery, mourning the loss of her diamonds far more than she mourned the loss of her freedom. The dismantling of the estate escalated rapidly. Agents unspooled bright red evidence tape, stretching it across the grand mahogany doorways. The tape formed a striking grid, sealing the elegant rooms off from the rest of the world. A specialized technical team marched down the hallway toward my father's private study. I heard the high-pitched whine of heavy-duty drills, biting into solid steel. They were breaching the hidden wall safes Richard used to store his offshore routing keys and unregistered cash reserves. Other agents carried out desktop computers, encrypted laptops, and towering stacks of physical ledgers. They placed the electronics into anti-static bags, preserving the digital footprints of their extensive fraud. The financial fortress my family had built on a foundation of tax evasion was being gutted piece by piece. They were losing every single asset they valued. Agent Sterling gave the final signal. The extraction order was confirmed. Officers hauled Richard, Patricia, and Harper toward the main corridor. They marched them past the shattered front doors and out onto the wide stone porch. The cool night wind hit their faces. They expected to quietly enter the back of the waiting police cruisers under the cover of darkness. They expected to retain a tiny fraction of their dignity away from the prying eyes of the public. I had ensured that would never happen. The moment they stepped onto the front steps, the darkness of the estate lawn erupted into a blinding sea of white light. Dozens of camera flashes fired in rapid succession, creating a continuous, strobing glare. The sudden illumination revealed a throng of journalists, news vans, and financial reporters crowded behind the iron gates of the driveway. Microphones were thrust forward over the wrought iron barrier. I had sent an anonymous, encrypted tip to every major news outlet in the city 2 hours before the raid commenced. I provided them with the exact time, the location, and the specific high-profile nature of the impending arrests. My father thrived on public perception. He built his entire career on the illusion of aristocratic superiority. I wanted the collapse of that illusion broadcast in high definition across every morning news program in the country. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away from the relentless flashbulbs. He tried to hide his face behind his shoulder, but the handcuffs restricted his movements. The reporters shouted rapid-fire questions about the shadow trusts, the tax evasion, and the offshore accounts. The elite reputation he spent a lifetime cultivating was pulverized on live television. Patricia hung her head, letting her disheveled hair fall forward to mask her ruined makeup. Harper wept openly, the bright camera lights exposing her tear-stained face and bare, jewelry-free neck to the world. They were shoved into the back seats of separate cruisers, the heavy doors slamming shut and sealing them inside their new reality. I stood on the stone porch, watching the chaotic scene unfold. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the driveway, painting a picture of flawless justice. The sirens wailed as the convoy began to slowly navigate through the sea of news vans, transporting my family away from the mansion. They would never step foot inside again. The operation was a resounding success, but the night was far from over. As the last police cruiser turned out of the estate gates, a solitary figure stepped out from the shadows near the manicured hedges. He walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the center of the driveway, the gravel crunching softly beneath his polished shoes. He held a thick, heavy stack of legal documents in his right hand. The ultimate reckoning for the golden child was about to be served, and Marcus was ready to deliver the final strike. The heavy tires of the armored transport vehicles had torn deep, jagged trenches into the pristine turf of the front lawn. The manicured grass my father obsessed over was reduced to a chaotic landscape of mud and crushed foliage. Through the swirling mist of exhaust fumes and flashing emergency lights, Marcus stepped out from the dense shadows of the ancient oak trees lining the perimeter. He wore a sharp, tailored black suit, the dark fabric absorbing the chaotic strobes of the police cruisers. He moved with the slow, measured stride of a sovereign reclaiming a stolen kingdom. There was no hesitation in his posture. He navigated the muddy terrain without looking down. His dark eyes locked firmly on the final target. Harper stood shivering against the side of a federal transport vehicle. Her hands were secured behind her back with heavy steel cuffs. The cold autumn wind whipped her disheveled hair across her face, sticking to the tear tracks, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked tiny, stripped of her designer accessories and the arrogant entitlement that usually shielded her from reality. She heard the crunch of gravel and lifted her head. When her eyes registered Marcus approaching, a sudden, desperate spark of hope ignited in her gaze. Her delusion ran so deep that she genuinely believed her husband had arrived to orchestrate a last-minute rescue. She thought his presence meant he was bringing his high-powered corporate lawyers to post bail and shield her from the nightmare unfolding around her. "Marcus?" she choked out, her voice a ragged, high-pitched plea. She tried to step toward him, but a female officer placed a firm hand on her shoulder, holding her against the cold metal of the vehicle. "Thank God you are here. Tell them to let me go." Chloe set us up. My parents forced me to go along with the escrow account. I had no choice. "Please, get me out of these cuffs. I want to go home to our son." Marcus stopped exactly 3 feet away from her. He did not reach out to offer comfort. He did not display a single trace of the warmth or patience he had granted her during their marriage. His face was carved from granite, an unreadable mask of clinical detachment. "You do not have a home." "Harper," Marcus stated. His deep baritone voice sliced through the ambient noise of the police radios and idling engines. It carried the chilling, irrevocable finality of a judge delivering a terminal sentence. "And you certainly do not have a son?" Harper breath hitched. The desperate spark in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by a sudden, creeping terror. She stared at him, her chest heaving as her mind struggled to process the sheer coldness of his tone. Marcus reached inside his tailored jacket and withdrew a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. The papers were bound by a sturdy metal clip, the front page bearing the unmistakable seal of a federal family court judge. He did not hand the packet to her, knowing her hands were bound. Instead, he dropped the heavy stack directly onto the hood of the police cruiser right in front of her face. The thick paper hit the metal with a sharp, definitive smack. "Those are expedited divorce filings," Marcus explained, his gaze piercing right through her trembling facade. "But they represent a minor administrative detail compared to the rest of the packet. Lying right beneath that decree is an emergency injunction terminating your parental rights, signed by a judge less than an hour ago." Harper let out a strangled gasp. She thrashed against the officer hold, her eyes darting frantically to the documents resting on the hood. "You cannot do that," she shrieked, panic eroding her vocal cords. "I am his mother. A judge will not take a boy away from his mother just because of a financial misunderstanding. You have no legal grounds." Marcus tilted his head, observing her frantic denial with a predatory stillness. "A financial misunderstanding," he repeated, testing the phrase on his tongue. "You drained his 529 education trust to fund your hotel rendezvous with a personal trainer. You siphoned $300,000 from a 4-year-old boy to buy designer handbags and luxury watches. That is grand larceny. He stepped an inch closer, lowering his voice into a lethal, quiet register. But stealing his college fund was merely the beginning of your indictment. When Chloe and I audited your hidden accounts, we discovered you used his social security number to open fraudulent lines of credit to hide your spending from me. You committed identity theft against your own child. The family court judge saw the financial forensics. They saw the federal warrants pending against you for money laundering and tax evasion. They granted me sole physical and legal custody in under 10 minutes. The air seemed to leave Harper's lungs. Her knees buckled, and she would have collapsed onto the muddy driveway if the federal officer had not hauled her upright by the elbows. The reality of her situation crushed the breath out of her. She was losing her access to the venture capital fortune she loved more than anything else. You are going to a federal penitentiary, Marcus continued, stripping away the last remnants of her hope. You are going to stand trial for conspiring to defraud the government and laundering illicit funds through Delaware shell companies. The state will seize whatever items you have left in your possession to satisfy the impending tax liens. He paused, letting the devastating legal reality sink deep into her bones. You are going to rot in a concrete cell for a very long time. And when you finally get out, you will possess empty hands. You will have no money, no property, and no family. You will be a convicted felon with a ruined name, barred from ever coming within 100 yards of the boy you tried to exploit. Harper's mind fractured under the sheer weight of his words. The polished socialite vanished, leaving behind a feral, broken shell. She threw her head back and unleashed a piercing, guttural scream that echoed into the night sky. She kicked her bare feet against the side of the police cruiser, twisting her body in a futile attempt to break free from the handcuffs. "Marcus, please," she wailed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her complexion. "I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. Just let me see him one last time. Do not erase me. I am begging you." Marcus did not flinch. He watched her tearful breakdown with the cold, unyielding precision of an auditor closing a bankrupt ledger. The emotional manipulation that had governed their relationship for years held zero power over him now. The transaction was complete. The debt was settled. He turned his back on his weeping wife. He did not offer a final goodbye. He did not grant her a parting glance. He simply walked away, leaving her pleading voice to be drowned out by the harsh slam of the heavy reinforced door of the police transport vehicle. I stood near the edge of the stone porch, watching him walk toward me. The flashing strobe lights painted his silhouette against the dark backdrop of the estate. He stopped right beside me, slipping his hands into the pockets of his dark trousers. We stood shoulder to shoulder in companionable silence, our eyes tracking the movement of the federal convoy. The engines of the armored vehicles roared to life. The tires gripped the asphalt, pulling the line of cruisers down the long, winding driveway. They carried my father, my mother, and my sister away from the grand mansion they had weaponized against me for decades. We watched the red taillights shrink into the distance, eventually disappearing past the iron gates and swallowed entirely by the dark suburban night. The sprawling estate behind us felt different now. The suffocating aura of unearned superiority had evaporated, replaced by the sterile, echoing emptiness of a seized asset. The yellow crime scene tape crisscrossed the mahogany double doors, marking the end of a corrupt dynasty. "They pushed you into a corner," Marcus murmured, his deep voice breaking the quiet chill of the autumn wind. "They expected you to cower in the dark. They had no idea they were forcing you to learn how to see in it." I pulled my tailored blazer tighter against the cold. The chill in the air felt refreshing. They spent my entire life teaching me that loyalty meant silent compliance, I replied, my gaze fixed on the empty iron gates. They taught me that surviving in this family required shrinking my own existence to feed their egos. Their cruelty manufactured the exact weapons I needed to dismantle them. Marcus nodded slowly. They built the monsters that devoured their empire. We stood together on the torn grass, two individuals linked by a shared betrayal and a flawless execution of justice. We had navigated a treacherous labyrinth of corporate fraud, identity theft, and attempted murder. We had outmaneuvered shadow financiers and turned an intricate federal trap into a flawless victory. The blood debt my family accrued over a lifetime of manipulation and greed had been paid in full, down to the very last cent. The ledger was finally clean. The night air settled over the silent estate. The heavy burden of my past was officially locked inside a federal transport van, speeding toward a concrete cell. I turned away from the driveway, ready to step into a future I controlled entirely. But the final chapter of my grandfather's brilliant legal design remained unwritten, and a $40 million shadow trust was waiting to be unleashed upon the financial world. 6 months evaporated into the relentless gears of the federal justice system. The wheels of a federal indictment turn slowly, but they grind unyielding bone into dust. I sat in the polished wooden gallery of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The air conditioning hummed a steady, sterile tune, masking the profound destruction of my biological family. They stood before a federal judge, stripped of their tailored Italian suits and emerald silk blouses. Richard wore an oversized orange jumpsuit that sagged around his defeated frame. His silver hair, once meticulously styled for country club dinners, was thinning and unkempt. Patricia stood beside him, her face hollowed out, her eyes staring blankly at the mahogany bench. The aristocratic socialite was gone, replaced by a trembling, destitute inmate. Harper flanked them, her shoulders hunched, weeping silent, pathetic tears into her chained hands. The judge did not offer leniency. He viewed their systemic tax evasion, wire fraud, and extortion as a calculated assault on the financial integrity of the nation. The gavel struck the sound block with a sharp, definitive crack. Richard and Patricia received 20 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. They would spend the rest of their natural lives behind reinforced steel doors. Harper, for her active role in laundering illicit funds through the escrow accounts, received a 12-year sentence. The financial fallout was swift and total. The government initiated immediate asset forfeiture. United States Marshals seized the sprawling suburban estate, auctioning it off to satisfy the astronomical tax liens. The fleet of luxury vehicles, the offshore Cayman accounts, the designer jewelry, all of it was liquidated. They traded a kingdom built on deceit for an 8x10 concrete cell. I watched them shuffle out of the courtroom through the side door. I did not feel pity. The ledger was balanced. With the toxic debt neutralized and the criminals incarcerated, the true architecture of my grandfather's estate was ready to be unveiled. 3 days after the sentencing, I sat across from Evelyn in her downtown law office. The mahogany table where this entire war began was cleared of all documents, save for one thick, leather-bound portfolio. I reached into my pocket and placed the silver $1 coin onto the polished wood. The coin was the biometric key identifier, the final piece of the puzzle Winston had designed. Evelyn picked it up, verifying the minted year and the subtle, microscopic engraving etched into the ridges. She nodded, her expression reflecting deep professional respect. By retaining the coin and shielding it from Richard's grasping hands, I had successfully navigated the legal minefield. Winston's Shadow Trust was divided into 2 distinct hemispheres. The first was the poison subsidiary, designed to trap my father. The second hemisphere, the one unlocked by the silver coin, contained $40 million in pristine, fully audited, legitimate offshore assets. These funds were generated decades ago, routed through legal international investments, and stored in a secure Swiss vault far beyond the reach of my father's real estate firm. Evelyn slid a titanium pen across the desk. I signed my name on the final transfer deed. The ink flowed smoothly, lacking any of the jagged, disconnected lines of a duress signature. I was officially the sole executing trustee of a fortified financial empire. The money was clean, unburdened by tax liens or shadow financiers. Winston had protected his true legacy, trusting me to wield it with the exact same ruthless precision he used to build it. I did not hoard the capital. In the world of high-stakes finance, stagnant money is a liability. I used the trust to establish my own independent firm. I leased the top floor of a gleaming glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the Manhattan financial district. The elevator opened directly into a sprawling reception area lined with dark slate and brushed chrome. It was a space designed to project unshakable authority. My firm specialized in forensic auditing and risk compliance for ultra-high net worth individuals. We dismantled corporate fraud, traced hidden offshore accounts, and provided airtight legal dossiers to victims of financial abuse. I hired a team of elite analysts, former federal investigators, and cybersecurity experts. The woman who once sat in a gray cubicle checking compliance forms was now the chief executive officer of an elite intelligence syndicate. My name became synonymous with corporate execution. When corrupt executives saw my auditors walk into their lobbies, they knew their reign was over. The corner office belonged to me. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the sprawling metropolis below. The city looked like a grid of endless possibilities, a network of contracts, liabilities, and leverage. I stood behind my custom obsidian desk, organizing the operational reports for the upcoming quarter. The firm was projecting a 40% revenue increase. Driven by a series of high-profile recoveries we executed for a major international banking institution. The success was tangible, measured in market dominance and ironclad security protocols. The heavy glass doors of my office slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Marcus walked into the room, holding a sleek digital tablet and 2 cups of dark roast coffee. He wore a sharp, navy blue suit, his posture radiating the confident, grounded energy of a man who had reclaimed his life. The heavy shadow of his disastrous marriage to Harper had vanished entirely. When I launched the forensic firm, I offered Marcus the position of lead strategic partner. His venture capital expertise, combined with his flawless ethical record, made him the perfect counterpart to my investigative operations. We functioned as an impenetrable unit. I located the hidden vulnerabilities in a corporate structure, and he determined the most profitable method to leverage or liquidate the asset. We secured the final clearance on the European tech acquisition, Marcus stated, handing me a coffee. The offshore ledgers were clean. We bypassed the regulatory hurdles, and the target company agreed to our restructuring terms. The ink dries on Monday. I took a sip of the coffee, appreciating the bitter, dark flavor. Excellent work, I replied, reviewing the data on his tablet. How is the transition going at home? Marcus smiled, a genuine expression of profound peace. The new house is quiet. The security system is fully integrated. My son spent the entire morning building a motorized architectural model on the living room rug. He is thriving. The custody decree is airtight, and he will never have to witness the kind of chaotic manipulation that defined his early years. We are safe. The knowledge that his 4-year-old son was protected, insulated from the greed that poisoned my own childhood, was the ultimate victory. Marcus had survived the crossfire of my family implosion, emerging with his reputation unblemished and his paternal rights cemented by a federal judge. We traded a toxic bloodline for a chosen alliance built on mutual respect, logic, and unwavering loyalty. Marcus left the office to finalize the European contracts, leaving me alone in the quiet expanse of the penthouse suite. The sun began to set, painting the Manhattan skyline in vibrant shades of gold and deep violet. The transition from day to night signaled the end of the operational hours, but the city below never truly slept. It buzzed with the constant, frantic energy of ambition and survival. I walked over to the private wet bar tucked into the corner of the room. I retrieved a crystal goblet and poured a measure of aged, dark red wine. The liquid caught the fading sunlight, glowing like a polished ruby. I carried the glass toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, resting my hand against the cool, thick glass pane. I looked down at the streets, watching the tiny vehicles navigate the concrete canyons. My parents spent their entire lives trying to teach me that success was inherited. That power was a birthright bestowed upon the golden children who followed the rules of high society. They believed that standing at the top of the world required a prestigious last name and a willingness to crush the weak. They were wrong. True power does not stem from the dining room table you sit at during childhood. It does not come from the country club memberships or the designer labels you wear to mask your insecurities. True power is forged in the silent, unrelenting pursuit of leverage. It is measured by your willingness to outsmart the predators who try to corner you. Power is looking at the people who stand in your way, analyzing their structural flaws, and orchestrating their downfall with surgical, unyielding precision. My family demanded compliance, assuming my quiet nature indicated submission. They thought they could manipulate a risk compliance officer into signing away her future to cover their federal crimes. They failed to realize that when you corner a woman who hunts anomalies for a living, she does not panic. She audits the battlefield, identifies the toxic debt, and hands you the detonator. Blood does not dictate family. Shared genetics are merely a biological coincidence, a random roll of the dice that means nothing without integrity. Loyalty, forged through shared battles and mutual defense, is the only currency that defines true kinship. I stood shoulder to shoulder with a brother-in-law who proved his worth under fire, while the people who shared my last name rotted in a federal cage. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the red wine, savoring the rich, complex notes. The taste of victory was sharp and flawless. The empire of lies my father built had crumbled into ash, and I used that exact ash to pour the concrete foundation of my own untouchable kingdom. The chessboard was cleared. The king and queen were captured. The final move was executed with pristine, lethal accuracy, and the game was officially, permanently won. I set the empty crystal goblet on the obsidian desk. The night air outside my Manhattan penthouse was a stark reminder of the calculating precision that brought me here. They handed me a $1 coin, expecting me to shrink into the shadows of their grand, fraudulent empire. Instead, I used that piece of silver to trigger their demise. My parents and sister are now just inmate numbers fading into the federal penitentiary system, while Marcus and I dictate the terms of the financial sector. Looking back at the wreckage of the Davis family, the path from a bullied daughter to a corporate titan is paved with 3 specific, undeniable truths. First, biological ties are never a binding contract for enduring abuse. Society conditions us to believe that sharing DNA mandates endless forgiveness and blind compliance. We are taught to sacrifice our own peace to keep toxic relatives comfortable. I rejected that narrative. True family is not a genetic lottery. It is a chosen alliance forged in mutual respect, shared integrity, and unwavering defense. You owe zero loyalty to people who view you as a disposable asset. Severing a rotting branch is the only way to save your own life. Second, silence is the most lethal weapon in your arsenal. When manipulators attempt to corner you, they feed on your emotional panic. They crave the screaming matches, the tears, and the frantic defenses because chaos masks their own profound vulnerabilities. Deprive them of that oxygen. When they threaten your livelihood, do not argue. Audit the battlefield. Gather the digital footprints. Secure the leverage, and let their own breathtaking arrogance dig a grave so deep they can never climb out. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one holding the actual keys to the kingdom. Finally, financial independence is your ultimate fortress. Never leave your assets exposed to the whims of another person. Build the blind trusts, secure the ledgers, and understand the mechanics of your own wealth. The reason I survived the extortion plot was not just psychological resilience, it was structural, mathematical preparation. When you command your own economic survival, no one can ever force you to sign away your soul under duress. You have the authority to rewrite the ending of your own narrative. Do not let the people who underestimated you dictate your worth. Have you ever had to use cold, hard logic to dismantle a toxic relative who thought they held all the leverage? Share your journey in the comments below. If you found satisfaction in watching this corrupt empire fall, hit the like button and subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories for more meticulously calculated justice. Never forget, the greatest revenge is an impenetrable, untouchable life.